It's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. She's somebody who I personally have a lot of respect and admiration for. She is the Global Events Coordinator. Many of you know her. She leads and motivates the team in organizing events such as this one. Please put your hands together for Charlene Barzaghi.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us here for the 5th annual Zeitgeist Day. How you all feeling? Good. And we want to give a special acknowledgement to our global audience watching around the world. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Charlene Barzaghi, and I've been with the Zeitgeist movement since 2010, assisting mostly with event planning for global and Los Angeles events. Today, however, I'm going to present a brief introduction to the Zeitgeist movement and hopefully set the tone for the rest of the program. With almost a dozen speakers, we have tried our best to unify this message as a whole, and it is our intention by the end of the program, you'll have a clear and concise understanding about what the Zeitgeist movement is and how it operates. Founded in 2008, the Zeitgeist movement, TZM for short, is a sustainability advocacy group, which operates through a network of regional chapters, projects, public events, and media expressions. We also promote charity operations and other acts of kindness to help existing suffering. However, it's important to note that is not the core focus of TZM. The entire point of the movement is to resolve such issues so these acts of charity are no longer needed. Our activism is based on nonviolent methods of communication, with the core focus on educating the public about the true root sources of many common personal, social, and ecological problems today, coupled with the vast problem-solving and humanity-improving potential science and technology available that goes unapplied due to barriers inherent in the current established system. While the term activism is correct by its exact meaning here, TZM's awareness work should not be misconstrued as the culturally common activist protest actions we have historically seen. Rather, the Zeitgeist movement expresses itself mostly through targeted education projects that work to set in motion a train of thought that is logically self-realizing. TZM's pursuits are actually very similar to civil rights movements of the past, in that they reveal the oppression inherent in our current social order. Due to archaic established methods which structurally and sociologically restrict human well-being, the vast majority of the world's population unnecessarily suffers. Today, it could be said there exists in the modern world a form of bigotry, which is no less insidious than racial or gender discrimination. This comes in the form of economics at its core. This bigotry is apparent in the class war alive today, as different groups of people jockey for advantage, perfectly willing to forego the well-being of others in the incentive psychology inherent to the competitive market economy. However, this inherent bigotry is really only part of a larger condition, which could be termed structural violence, illuminating a broad spectrum of built-in deprivation and inhumanity that is simply accepted as normality today by an uninformed majority. The bottom line here is that when we step back and consider realities that are clearly having detrimental effects on the human condition, yet go unabated by the establishment, we inevitably end up in the context of civil rights and hence social sustainability. This new civil rights movement is not only about the sharing of human knowledge and our technical ability to resolve problems, but more so to facilitate a new, scientifically derived social system that actually optimizes our well-being rather than restrict it. The fact is, anything less will create imbalance and is simply a hidden form of oppression. So, the Zeitgeist movement works not only to create awareness of such problems and their true systemic roots, it also works to express the potential we have to greatly improve the human condition in general. This could be summarized as the application of the scientific method for social concern. TZM is an emergent state of mind. This is about a train of thought, a worldview. We're not here to impose a set of ideas on you or get you to join the movement as a club, per se. Rather, it is about you deciding the merit and logic for yourself, so you can adjust your own actions and intentions accordingly. In fact, in many ways, we are all in the Zeitgeist movement, whether we know it or not, since each of us are receiving, morphing, and transmitting data on the social level all the time, creating a constant evolution of the Zeitgeist itself. The question is, are we as a species moving in the right direction? And how do we measure such a thing? Is there a benchmark which can guide us? Yes. It exists in our alignment with the natural laws of our world in the most fundamental sense. Building our values and social approaches from these core truths about what it means to be human and live in the habitat we do. Take a look at the current monetary market economy and ask yourself, is this pro-Earth? Is built-in scarcity, imbalance, obsolescence, waste, pollution, constant consumption, the intelligent management of the Earth's resources? At this rate, are we exceeding the carrying capacity of the Earth? A term you will hear frequently today is the gesture of a new social system called a natural law resource-based economy, or NLRBE for short. A natural law resource-based economy is defined as an adaptive socioeconomic system actively derived from direct physical reference to the governing scientific laws of nature. And Jen Wilding put together this great graphic that I think points out the characteristics very well. Thanks, Jen. Most people don't realize the current state of technology we have that could be profoundly more effective in meeting the needs of the human population. However, this approach inherently challenges all forms of traditionalism in the world today. The ancient whims and dynamics of the dominant political and financial establishments not only become inapplicable, they are seen as deeply flawed and detrimental. We need to remember that modern scientific causality, something we very much take for granted today, has really only been with us for a couple hundred years in broad awareness and practice. Yet, even today, this scientific train of thought is just barely being given respect on the social level, usually only in response to various ecological crises resulting from industrial human actions. For the first time in human history, we have people actually talking about being green as though it's new, as though we were ever supposed to be anything but, given the most basic principles of human and ecological sustainability. So, in conclusion to this brief introduction, let it be stated that the real revolution is the revolution of values. Sustainable beliefs precede sustainable practices. And if our values are not in accord with the natural laws that govern our planet, if our values are not in accord with what can create true well-being, then clearly we cannot expect to move forward with transformative technical changes. It is important to note that the Zeitgeist movement's interest is purely global. Nation, race, religion, or other such notions of division are not recognized in this equation, since when you break them all down, they are artificial contrivances created mostly by fear. Instead, we see the human species as one family, all sharing the same basic needs, and the Earth as one habitat with no borders. May we walk into this bright future together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This lecture is called A Short History of Economic Thought. We're going to explore in an almost haphazardly concise manner the most notable attributes of the historical unfolding of the market-based economic tradition as we know it. And while we could go back thousands of years in such an analysis, we'll be focusing mostly on the most relevant, causal, influential ideas emerging from the 17th to the 20th century. As an aside, even though this will likely be the most boring presentation you hear today, I personally find economic history incredibly interesting because it's really a history of perception. If you were to ask a Neolithic or pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherer what their economic model was, if they could even conceive of such a thing, It would likely have something to do with strategic harvesting around seasonal periods of earthly regeneration, locating optimized yields, tactics for physical storage, and the like. Today, of course, things have become much more complicated. Yet, we should not be intimidated by modern economics, regardless of how sophisticated it may appear. In fact, I would say that our current practice originated in exactly the same way all the other practices did, with people basically just making stuff up as they go along, based around apparent evidence that seems to make sense, with usually a grace period of sorts before the inevitable fallacy of certain assumptions surface through negative consequences. As a final introductory note, I would like to set the tone by stating outright that the vast majority of what we call economics, as it is presented in universities and financial circles today, is really an outdated, irrelevant, and increasingly detrimental form and system when it comes to the actual maintenance of life on the planet Earth. It's life-blind is a great term. There is no structural recognition of any basic natural law processes, principles of earthly sustainability, public health factoring, and the like. In the view of the market, these are externalities. And in the millions of pages of mainstream economic theory printed from the 17th century onward, you will likely find not one sentence about the natural technical processes that actually create and assist in meeting human needs, the sociological importance of meeting those needs for social stability and invariably public health, generating optimized industrial methods to ensure overall efficiency, or anything of such. To paraphrase economist Thorstein Veblen, who will be mentioned again in a moment, a prominent historical figure, there are really two systems at work. There's a business system, and there's a technical or scientific system. The business system has, again, no active recognition of the technical system, hence the natural science behind it. And it works in the modern era to now perpetually sabotage, in the words of Veblen, our scientific capacity and possibility due to its outdated, narrow frames of reference. The point being that true economics can only be understood within the context of physical science, and the traditional market logic has been backwards in its orientation, with most everything centered around short-sighted, subjective intuitions, mostly having to do with human behavior and human nature. Pre-capitalism. Medieval feudalism, which spanned roughly from the 9th to 16th centuries, was a system of mutual obligations and services going up and down a set social hierarchy, with the entire system essentially resting on an agricultural foundation, an agrarian foundation. There is great speculation with respect to what happened in Europe to transition out of feudalism, but technology appears to have played a major role, as it has, in fact, with virtually every major social shift. Advanced agricultural transport, enhanced regional trade, better connecting different settlements, facilitating the development of markets in more regions, generating an increasingly more prominent system of merchants, a merchant class, if you will, were the artisan producers of the medieval period, which were prior to the point of sale for the most part for their goods, began to more frequently sell wholesale to these merchants who went afar and retraded for profit. This commercial expansion around the late 16th century helped facilitate what is now retroactively termed mercantilism, which operated in Europe up through about the late 18th century. Mercantilism has many definitions these days, depending on who you ask, but it essentially is characterized by state-driven foreign trade monopolies to ensure what they called a positive balance of trade. In short, it was a powerful collusion between the state and commercial industries. And a notable characteristic of mercantilism, something that carries over to this day, was the large amount of national conflict because of the restrictions and protectionist policies put forward by different nations. Economic warfare, in effect. And it was in this overall environment in the late 18th century, Adam Smith, one of the most well-known economists with respect to market theory today, wrote his classic text, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. In this, he writes an extensive criticism of mercantilism, advocated instead a form of trade and interaction which was to operate ideally without national coercion and restrictions of the state. And while many of us might criticize Smith today for his short-sightedness, as I will discuss more so in a moment, we should realize that it was an important move in the evolution of economy and the development of civilization. The free market, as it is termed, opened the door to a kind of immature, unstable, yet creative experimentation, facilitated in truth by the parallel growth of science and technology. However, as with lots of creative immaturity, as we might see in young children, such active behavior does not necessarily constitute responsible or sustainable behavior, as we will discuss. So to quickly generalize this evolution, from the Middle Ages, we went from a rather static, localized agrarian society with a strong social order and hierarchy to further advancement of technology, more expansive trade, communication, and commerce, furthering an ever-increasing merchant class which simultaneously reconsolidated nation-state power. And then from Adam Smith onward, we find a slow, subtle breakdown of protectionist trade techniques occurring, both domestic and international, working to, in theory, promote the freedom of the producers and hence the freedom of society itself, with what is now abstractly generalized as the free market or free market capitalism as it worked out by the mid-19th century. Now, what's important to understand here is the apparent shift of the power center itself, a move from large-scale state economic control to so-called business or personal freedom. The problem, however, is that the state economic interests and corporate business interests are one and the same. All we have done in this overall process, in effect, which again was indeed helpful to a certain degree as it expanded our capacity, was go from state control of business to now business control of the state. Today we live in an advanced manifestation of this with the advent of what could be deemed the corporate state, where business interests hold final decision-wielding power at every turn, with, gesturally speaking, the elitist kings and nobility of the feudalist period redefined, behind the scenes of course, in the form of a constituency of financial and corporate powers. In other words, while change did arguably occur for the better in very basic ways, it has only occurred within a very rigid, locked framework of class elitism and power allocation that is indeed based on the same basic underlying elitist philosophical worldview. Capitalism. Before we delve into the psychological and sociological assumptions that underlie the socioeconomic condition we endure today, let's quickly review the core characteristics structurally of the free market capitalist system. 1, market-based production distribution. Commodity production is based around interrelationships that usually do not involve direct personal interactions between producers and end consumers. Instead, supply and demand is mediated by a mechanism called the market, using money. 2, private ownership of production means. Society grants to private persons the right to dictate how the raw materials, tools, machinery, and buildings necessary for production can be used. Number 3, decoupling of ownership and labor. Capitalists, by historical definition, own the means of production, but yet have no obligation to contribute to production itself. Everything produced by the laborers, who in effect only really own their labor itself, is owned by the capitalist by legal authority. I'll touch upon this again in a second. And number 4, a self-maximizing incentive is assumed. Individualistic, competitive, and inquisitive interests are necessary for the successful functioning of capitalism, since a constant pressure to consume and expand is needed to avoid recessions, depressions, loss of growth, and other negatives. Underneath the surface of these 4 characteristics are essentially 6 fundamental premises, and we will talk about these in pairs as they relate. Property and the labor theory of value, utilitarianism and the utility theory of value, the invisible hand metaphysic, and the conclusion that classes imbalance and suffering is inevitable. If everyone in this room can understand the failed intuitions, truncated frames of reference, and general fallacy of these 6 concepts, as they are defended by proponents today, you will be able to break down pretty much every PhD economist's arguments in support of the current model. Property and the labor theory of value. Property and function is a basic intuition found throughout all of human society, based around a territorialism of sorts that can also be found, of course, across the animal kingdom in general. The argument isn't the obvious necessity to be secure with our means and tools of survival, recognizing that protection has been needed as we evolve out of these long periods of scarcity, hence the generation of constant conflict. The problem is the application of the theoretical concept of property itself, its value assessment, and how it is rationalized in and put in function within the internal logic of the capitalist system. Now, I could say a great deal about the sickness of our property culture today, as fueled by the consumption ethos pushed like a bad drug. But that will be for another talk. However, let it be said that property as a means of useful function is viable. Property as a unit of vanity and social status is an underlying social distortion, which, when extrapolated in its effects, as quaint as it may seem, is extremely destabilizing. Philosopher John Locke, who died in the early 18th century, published a highly influential book, The Second Treatise of Civil Government, in 1689. And in chapter 5, Locke expresses his view regarding the origin of property, which is carried over in one variation or another into modern free market economic theory as we know it today. As was natural to that period of time in Europe, Locke's premise for defining property was derived from a Christian perspective, stating, God gave the world to men in common, but since he gave it to them for their benefit and for the greatest conveniences of life, they were capable to draw from it. He can't have meant it always to remain common and uncultivated. I don't know about you, but I always enjoy it when humans redefine what God actually meant. In short, Locke states that property is created when a person mixes his labor with it. The logic being that the labor energy put into the making of a good must naturally be the property of the person performing the task, and hence that property labor is transferred into the good itself. So God put stuff on the earth in common, we attach the right of property to it because we are mixing our labor with it, and then we use it for our purposes. Fair enough. Adam Smith clearly agreed with Locke's labor-based property definition and later applied this logic to what could be termed the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value suggests that the labor put into the creation of something not only assigns ownership or property, it also determines in part where its value or exchange value is sourced. He states, labor was the first price, the original purchase money that was paid for all things. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased, and its value to those who possess it. David Ricardo, a firm disciple of Smith a generation later, very influential, reinforced the same basic idea, stating in mild variation, possessing utility, commodities derive their exchange value from two sources, from their scarcity and from the quantity of labor required to obtain them. He continues with the logic. If the quantity of labor realized in commodities regulates their exchange value, every increase of the quantity of labor must augment the value of that commodity on which it is exercised, and every diminution must lower it. However, there's a problem here. If we are to respect these rules of property, value, and such attainment, how does money fit in? How does money serve as both a store of value and a medium of exchange when, in effect, its value attainment has no causal connection to anything related to human production? We just decide it has value and put it into circulation. Money, whether on the gold standard or fiat, is completely decoupled from the process of value and property creation. John Locke and Adam Smith make it clear that true wealth, the wealth of nations, is not a function of how much gold or silver or hence money economy has. It's actually the sum of the production, the goods and services the economy produces. That is the true definition of wealth as per Adam Smith, who states, the annual produce of the land and labor of the society is its wealth. And the main punchline is that money can buy labor. What does this mean? It means that one can buy the actual process of value creation and ownership creation with a fake commodity that has neither of these causal attributes built into its existence. Capitalism's dominant feature exploits this, as the private ownership of the means of production, including labor through money, or capital as it's called, enables a form of power and wealth consolidation that is unprecedented as an economic system in causality, maximizing the use of this fraudulent, made-up commodity. This basic contradiction, as minor as it may seem, is actually quite dramatic, and it's been observed by many critics throughout history. Karl Marx, likely the most demonized economic thinker of all time, had a great deal correct with his criticisms of capitalist philosophy. I might not agree with his socialist conclusions, but his criticisms are quite acute. He states, "At first, the rights of property seem to us to be based on man's own labor. At least some such assumption was necessary, since only commodity owners with equal rights confronted each other, and the sole means by which a man could become possessed of the commodities of others was by alienating or giving up his own commodities, and these could be replaced again by labor alone. Now, however, property turns out to be the right on the part of the capitalist to appropriate, and to be the impossibility on the part of the laborer of appropriating his own product, the product made. The separation of property from labor has been the necessary consequence of a law that apparently originated in their identity," referring to the capitalists by definition. Economist Thorstein Veblen, and a brilliant sociologist, perhaps my favorite social critic, also rejected the idea of private property and that it was a natural right, often expressing the absurdity of thought again that leads what he called absentee owners, the owners that don't do anything, to claim ownership of commodities produced in reality by the manual labor of others, highlighting again the irrationality of the long-held principle that from labor comes property. However, Veblen went farther, and he expressed something much more profound than everything I just talked about. He expresses the social nature of production and how the skills and knowledge accumulation inherent completely voids the causal justification of property rights in and of themselves, stating, "The natural rights theory of property makes the creative effort of an isolated, self-sufficing individual the basis of ownership vested in him. In doing so, it overlooks the fact that there is no isolated, self-sufficing individual. Production takes place only in society, only through the cooperation of an industrial community. This industrial community may be large or small, but it always comprises a group large enough to contain and transmit the traditions, tools, technical knowledge, and usages without which there can be no industrial organization and no economic relation of individuals to one another or to their environment. There can be no production without technical knowledge, hence no accumulation and no wealth to be owned. And there is no technical knowledge apart from the industrial community. Since there is no individual production and no individual productivity, the natural rights preconception reduces itself to absurdity, even under the logic of its own assumptions." Think about it. How can we create anything of ownership in a physical or intellectual sense and be isolated? And how can we source anything to a single individual or select group? Veblen recognized basically that we live in a group mind. We live in a shared concept, whether we like it or not, and we share our ideas and skills. And you know, this rhetoric today we hear, it's very common in the right, in the conservative circles. You get what you work for. In this ethic, your contribution is the only thing that can manifest and improve life. Yet, did anyone in this room invent the automobile? Yes, we might have to pay for it at this time, but the general intellectual design and the hence thousands of years of scientific inquiry and awareness that manifest that piece of technology was given to us, given to our generation for free, along with countless other inherited lifestyle realities we take for granted. While our intuition and basic interest in our own well-being seems to support, again, this justification of property, whether physical or intellectual, the whole thing falls apart very rapidly when we take the perspective of social, intellectual development over generational time. So the next time someone tells you that you only deserve what you work for, tell them to go find a new earth, reconstruct the entire edifice of human civilization as we know it from the ground up, inventing everything as they go along, and only then will they deserve to have such things as a cell phone, mathematics, air conditioning, modern medicine, or the like. Moving on. Utilitarianism and the utility theory of value. Utilitarianism is, in many ways, both a psychological theory of how people behave and an ethical theory of how they ought to behave. Keep this in mind. It has many different schools of thought today, but in short, it is a model of behavior which is based around something of an impulsive, hedonistic assumption of human action in general. It deals with pleasure and pain and the idea that human beings basically react in favor of pleasure and work to avoid pain on all scales. Very convoluted, as I'll describe. A notable figure and proponent of utilitarianism is Jeremy Bentham, who died in the early 19th century. He stated, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do. By the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question." Utilitarianism is at the core of the microeconomic behavioral assumptions put forward by what is called neoclassical economics today. The assumption of people working to maximize their happiness and reduce suffering is a guiding principle, and various behavioral models of high complexity have also been created in these intellectual circles. Within this assumption, there are lots of other ideas built in naturally, such as the idea that humans are insatiable, and then we have infinite material wants, which will never make us satisfied. We have deeply ingrained need to be better than others and other competitive nuances and the like. However, before we address the obvious problems with these assumptions, it's important to point out what utilitarianism as a behavioral model and eventually as a model of value actually accomplishes. With the labor theory of value, the workers in a capitalist institution were simply another good to purchase, with value basically extracted systematically. However, as the relationship goes, the more workers are paid, the less profit is available for the owners. This is basic cost efficiency stuff you hear about in Economics 101. However, a troubling awareness underneath the surface, which was recognized by David Ricardo, Adam Smith, and others, is that this highlights a conflict between workers and owners. The owners wish to maximize their profits, while the workers wish to maximize their wages. David Ricardo made this very clear in his writings, and that the interest of workers and capitalists were always opposed, quoting, "If wages should rise," he often said, "then profits would necessarily fall." Now, this, of course, is quite true without dispute, but it's extremely inconvenient for those who really wish to believe capitalism is a system of social harmony. And the utility theory solves this. The utility theory of value states that a good value is mostly not derived from labor, but is based on the mere perception of those who wish to own. This new view, in effect, enables a detour from the class war problem, essentially reducing everyone to self-maximizing exchangers. And since everyone is exchanging on their own hedonistic behalfs and their gleaming self-interest, they are all operating in an abstract, equal playing field in some bizarre philosophical logic. I'm not kidding, this is an historical defense. Marx, of course, in all of his general belligerent glory, was very aware of this strange logic and stated, "Indeed, insofar as the commodity of labor is conceived of only as exchange value, and the relation in which the various commodities are brought into connection with one another is conceived of as the exchange of these exchange values, then the individuals are simply and only conceived of as exchangers. As far as the formal character is concerned, there is absolutely no distinction between them. As subjects of exchange, their relation is therefore that of equality." Veblen, who was probably even more horrified by the neoclassical economic assumptions, saw the idea that all human economic behavior was to be reduced to a hedonistic interplay of self-maximization and preservation as absurd. He even joked that a gang of Aleutian islanders slushing about in the rack and surf with rakes and magical incantations for the capture of shellfish are held in point of taxonomic reality to be engaged in a feat of hedonistic equilibration in rent, wages, and interest, and that's all there is to it. In the end, the problem with utilitarianism is that the distinction of what constitutes pleasure and what constitutes pain is not only utterly subjective, it is only predictive in the context of the most impulsive and short-sighted reactions. It is an apt recognition because, again, in the competitive market model of economics, this tendency is actually clearly reinforced. It reinforces this impulsive short-sightedness structurally all the time. For example, a corporation might not want to suffer the financial pain of proper disposal of toxic byproducts, so they dump it into the river next to the plant. However, when those local people go home to their families and turn on the tap water, not knowing that this river leads to a reservoir to which their water is sourced, they are going to suffer a great deal of pain in the long term due to cancer and other health problems that would result. I hope that is clear, as this perspective is likely the most dangerous of all perspectives in modern economic thought. The selfish self-maximization of utility as an assumption of behavior leads only to short-term pleasure at the expense of long-term suffering. The invisible hand, suffering, and class war. As a final set of premises, let's now examine the metaphysical notion of the famed invisible hand and the basic historical assumption of immutable class imbalance and human suffering. Returning to Adam Smith, it could be argued that his most notable contribution to the philosophy of capitalism was his general suggestion that even though individuals might act in a narrow, selfish manner, there was what he called the invisible hand at work that secured a positive social outcome in the long run. He stated, "As every individual therefore endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it." This nearly religious ideal had a powerful effect on the post-Smith era, giving, in fact, a very socialist vindication for the inherently self-maximizing, arguably antisocial behavior common to capitalist psychology. Implying a basic utilitarianism as well, under the surface of this is, of course, a glaring paradox. Smith considered the laissez-faire, or completely open form of capitalism, as the highest mode of socioeconomic operation, stating that it was a system of natural liberty, and every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest his own way and to bring both his industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men. Well, today, with 1% of the world's population owning 40% of the planet's wealth, 1 billion starving, literally not meeting nutritional requirements on a daily basis, and almost half the world in deep relative deprivation, there's ample proof that the mechanisms of the market economy clearly gravitate towards power consolidation and, in effect, the limiting of freedom, the limiting of health of many billions of people in the world today systematically. However, it's really interesting to see this consequence, because if you really examine Smith, Ricardo, and now Thomas Malthus, if you examine their writings in detail, you'll notice something very interesting, that the invisible hand, which suggests, implies, in fine print, the betterment of all, is really only acknowledged to help a deserving subsection of the population. Throughout all of their writings in general, they imply that suffering will remain regardless. And in the case of Ricardo and Malthus, they actually emphasize not helping the poor in some cases, as it only gives them false hope in the long run. The term naturalist fallacy can be applied here, as these thinkers were taking their intuitions about the limits of society and assuming they were empirical, just as they did in the Bible. And while we do not hear much about Malthus these days with respect to his incredibly incorrect population theory, which stated, among other things, that it was a law of nature to have rich and poor, along with the inevitable consequence of increasing reproduction as wealth increased, implying that the poor must exist or be repressed, since the carrying capacity cannot possibly handle everyone maintaining a quality standard of living as he knew it then. And these theories, unfortunately, still underlie the very core ethical assumptions pushed forward by the market economy's basic social approach today. So I ask you, if the dominant, most influential historical proponents of this economic model, a model which has spread across the world, planted this intellectual seed that it was impossible to take care of everyone and that poverty was inevitable and that it's only a higher moral class, in effect, that really deserves the fruits of a decent life, do you think that maybe it might explain why there has been virtually no real effort on the part of any large-scale establishment to actually resolve global suffering on any real level? Even though it has clearly, statistically, been technically possible for many, many decades now due to the advancements in technology. In conclusion, I wish to point out again that the capitalist market economy did facilitate a stage of improvement on a very basic level. As with anything in the course of evolution, there's no such thing as wrong if the mechanism of understanding, correction, and adaptation is working properly. And that's the problem today. We're not adapting fast enough. I see it as an issue of social maturity. If we look at cultural evolution as a process of adaptation, and with the needed vulnerable acceptance of new knowledge as the mechanism of change, we can begin to see that we are stuck or moving in a very slow way when it comes to the way we think about economics. Naturally, due to the extremely powerful reinforcement it has, generation after generation, it compounds this value neuroses over and over, creating increasing fear of change. And I hate to sound condescending, but right now I put the maturity level of human society in this regard at about the age of 9. We have an entire species of children selfishly running around the earth, hoarding toys, many still believing in Santa Claus, fighting over abundant toy blocks, pushing to the front of the line, jockeying for mommy's attention and status, creating little gangs to feel wanted and to feel powerful. And it isn't that we can't see a path of maturation. It's rather the sickness that exists in this household we share, the water we swim in, the foundational values and beliefs that currently embody the whole of our society, our ideological parents, the zeitgeist itself. And that's why we're here. It's now an issue of growing up. And whether anyone likes it or not, they are in the zeitgeist movement one way or another. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. As mentioned, my name is Matt Berkowitz. I'm a coordinator of the Vancouver chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement. I do all our media spokesmanship and lectures, coordinate our events, and I'm part of the TZM lecture team. Today I want to talk about communication, more specifically about common traps we often fall into in the course of everyday conversation. So I've titled this, Logical Fallacies and Cultural Baggage. If there's one thing that will help unify the world and our understanding of the natural world, it would have to be in developing superior communication skills with one another. Perhaps a secondary concern to overhauling the economic structure, but in many ways also a concomitant issue that needs to be dealt with in upgrading the human value system, is the need to socially evolve our communicative practices. In order for humanity to realize a new way of living, we're going to have to figure out how to communicate with our fellow human beings in a more mature, more scientific, and logical manner. Perhaps one of the greatest impediments to effective communication lies in a lack of common understanding of physical reference, very similar to the ambiguity of a clear physical referent for our economic system. This parallel should be understood. Imagine in the course of everyday conversation with someone else, if every word each of you used was commonly understood amongst the two of you. Would it not eradicate much of the potential for disagreement or imprecise communication? There's considerable evidence that the brain can process information much more competently with verbal and visual neurological anchor points, which allow ideas to be consolidated and identity is established. All the more reason for a rigorously defined physical reference for our language. Stuart Chase, in his seminal work entitled The Tyranny of Words, describes a continuum of the degrees of abstraction that words can possess. For example, words or word conglomerates like pencil, cell phone, evergreen tree, and the earth have referents that are fairly easily recognizable and could be placed at the lowest end of the abstraction continuum. Whereas words like freedom, individuality, spirituality are often quite vague, have multiple possible definitions, and often used sloppily in communication, and therefore they'd be placed at the highest level of abstraction. Part of the problem, of course, is the way in which the establishment has perverted various words and institutions that claim to portray essentially the opposite of what they're actually doing. In a world where news-selling institutions dictate what we believe and think like a propaganda machine, where music and other art forms are corrupted down to commercial ventures devoid of artistic integrity, and where free voluntary exchanges really translate to coerced slavery-inducing necessities, it's no wonder our current level of communicative discourse is confused. And then there's the utterly nonsensical abuse of the language by charlatans who wish to sound intelligent and sophisticated, humorously satirized by this Deepak Chopra quote generator. Who knows what the physical reference are in all of these examples? However, even if there were clear physical reference, the depraved culture we live in has an unfortunate tendency to cause people emotional upset when their established beliefs are challenged. So another major barrier to effective communication, and likewise the ability to update our beliefs and perspectives, lies in a common failure. This is very simply the failure to distinguish between criticism of an idea you hold and an attack on your character. While it is certainly true that many people do see themselves this way, this doesn't make the reality such. The fact that people with fixed belief systems, whether religious, political, economic, or otherwise philosophical, are unable to distinguish between information they believe being criticized and their character being attacked is a serious problem of any established belief system. Imagine if scientists who held competing theories operated this way. Imagine if when their theories were scrutinized for lack of soundness or validity, that rather than evaluating the criticism, they became personally offended at the attack on their character. We'd still be in the dark ages, and social progress would be nearly impossible. If society is ever going to mature, we need to become much better at making this distinction. To discuss a religious theology or other data set is not to discuss those who believe in or follow it. Information itself is neutral. To become entangled with the fate of information's validity is to make yourself vulnerable to it being disproven and thus suffer serious emotional distress. The beauty of the scientific worldview is that one can change his or her mind on a dime without suffering from emotional baggage that is created when one invests emotionally in a fixed belief. It's a sort of reverse ad hominem logical fallacy. Rather than being the person who is attacking the arguer instead of the argument, the person fails to distinguish between feeling attacked and having his or her argument attacked. And that brings me to my area of focus for this talk, logical fallacies. How they relate to effective communication, and more specifically, how we deal with the fallacies we frequently encounter when discussing and promoting the concepts we do in the Zeitgeist movement. So, what is a logical fallacy? It's very simply an error in logical argumentation, and there are two types. One is a formal fallacy, which refers to a flaw in a deductive argument, and the other is an informal fallacy, which is simply an argument that is fallacious for reasons other than the structural flaws. These are the types of logical fallacies I want to discuss today, as they can be more convoluted and difficult to spot. They're the kinds of trickery that are often dishonestly used to silence any dissenters of the status quo, and they're also simply the result of an ignorance of the information being presented and an inability to evaluate the claims being made, usually due to some personal bias or deep-rooted psychological conditioning. But usually, as is classic with illogical thinking, the person thinks he or she is being logical. Perhaps the most common logical fallacy there is the argument from ignorance, which asserts that a proposition is true simply because it has not yet been proven false. We often tend to inject our own preferential explanations into a real or perceived gap of knowledge, whether to reinforce some emotional association or to make it seem like we know more than we do. This is most common with religious claims, where the idea of God is used to plug in gaps in human understanding. However, we hear this type of fallacious reasoning all the time in the Zeitgeist movement. Perhaps the most common is the human nature argument, where people who are unaware of the true causes of human behavior attribute it to genes or human nature, simply because they are ignorant of the behavioral chain of causality. The same fallacy is also made by attributing unexplainable human behavior to the free will argument. That is, the originator of a person's behavior was that person, ruling out any possible prior cause. Really, unexplainable human behavior is just that, unexplainable. That is, until we figure out the mechanism that generates it. To invoke tired cliches like the human nature of free will arguments to fill such gaps are arguments from ignorance and thus inherently fallacious. The argument from ignorance often leads into another fallacy called the burden of proof fallacy, which is simply when someone who is making a claim attempts to shift responsibility to someone else to disprove that claim. Of course, the burden of proof or evidence is always on the person making the claim. Often, critics will propose that we're promoting something communist or totalitarian and assume the burden of proof is on us to disprove such a ridiculous contention. The onus is always on the person making any such proposition to validate such a claim. Then there is the ubiquitous ad hominem attack, a fallacy invoking the attack of a person's character in an attempt to undermine their argument, rather than addressing the argument. Any person or group that challenges dominant beliefs of the status quo that are held as sacrosanct will unfortunately make themselves a target for all sorts of emotionally driven personal attacks. The hate-filled TZM sites out there provide a number of humorous examples of this, which rarely address the specific claims of the movement, but rather seek to disparage through a range of emotionally driven tricks. Another tactic used to avoid addressing a particular claim or argument is to blindly reference a person in perceived authority. This is called the argument from authority, which doesn't advance discussion one iota, but rather is a plea to ignorance and an attempt to validate an idea because someone with credentials holds a similar view. We get many variations of this all the time. Those in opposition to our advocacy will often either reference some grandfather figure of free market theory to uphold the market system, or point out the lack of mainstream credentialed authorities who are sympathetic to TZM's claims, all the while not addressing the claims. Then there is the straw man, an extremely common fallacy, whether intentional or not. This is when someone misrepresents an argument to make it easier to attack. The Zeitgeist movement gets this in many forms, whether it's through erroneous labeling, as in accusations of promoting communism, anarchy, or some form of tyranny, or other rather comedic suggestions that we only advocate what we do because we don't want to work, or that we want to limit people's freedom. Another related fallacy is the association fallacy, where connections between two pieces of information are drawn where none exist. One version of the association fallacy is the prima facie, or face value association, whereby the person assumes that because two things share properties, they therefore must be the same. Again, we get this a lot with claims that we're promoting communism, socialism, a dictatorship, or other thoughtless distinctions. Often when two ideas share a similar characteristic or tenet, they're simply equated as the exact same. Changing gears here, we have the false cause fallacy, or the non sequitur, which incorrectly assumes that one thing is the cause of another. One common version of this is when two events may be correlated, but are falsely assumed to be causally linked. This is a fairly common fallacy we hear in many versions. For example, without a monetary incentive, as in a natural law resource-based economy, it is assumed by some that motivation will cease and nothing will get done, as though money is the only thing that generates incentive. It is blindly assumed that this carrot and stick approach of extrinsic motivation is causally sound, though the research indicates otherwise. Related to the false cause fallacy is the slippery slope fallacy, which relates an initial event to the inevitable culmination of a chain of related events with some significant effect overall, such as the unfounded assumption that the removal of the coerced labor for income system will lead people to laying around as lazy bums and the cessation of creativity. As mentioned about the previous fallacy regarding the science of motivation, the behavioral sciences finds this to be wholly fallacious. Next up is the loaded question fallacy, which is a question put forth that contains an unjustified presupposition or assumption, such as, how does the Zeitgeist movement plan to take away possessions of the rich in order to equalize society? Usually the best response to this kind of question is to challenge the assumption rather than attempt to answer the question. Closely related is the ambiguity fallacy, which involves someone using a double meaning, vague language, or some kind of semantic trick to misrepresent the truth. While politicians are often most guilty of this, people become entrapped in this fallacy quite often. In relation to TZM, we're often asked, what will happen to individuality or spirituality in such a new social model? As though such words have one strict meaning. And then there is the fallacy fallacy, which incorrectly assumes that the failure to defend an idea proves that that idea is false. Ironically, if you're unconvinced by what I'm saying, it doesn't necessarily mean that my claims are incorrect, just that I've failed to properly substantiate it. And then we have the mind projection fallacy, a common logic trap any person or group encounters when challenging traditional philosophies or values. It simply refers to when someone's subjective judgments are projected outwards, as though they are inherent properties of an object or system. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is with free market dogma, whereby the invisible hand is blindly invoked as a metaphysical, deistic process that ensures optimal social outcomes. The way the argument is used often disregards any possibility of a counter-argument and justifies or just assumes that this invisible hand is as immutable as a natural law. And next we have the bandwagon fallacy, where someone asserts that a proposition is true simply because many people believe it to be true. This fallacy is used in pretty much every way imaginable against individuals or groups who challenge any mainstream idea. And then we have the false duality fallacy. I'm sure most are familiar with this one, where two possibilities are presented as the only two, without any alternatives. Anytime you challenge a widely believed dogma, watch out for this one. If you're against capitalism, you must be a communist. If you're not a Christian, you must be a Satanist. And if you're against the free market, you must be for some form of tyranny. Closely related is the middle ground fallacy, where instead of insisting that one of two options are the only options, we insist that the truth must lie somewhere in the middle of the extremes. But perhaps the answer lies close to one or two of the extremes, or on a whole other level altogether. For example, the ideal socioeconomic model could of course not be accurately said to lie between the extremes of Marxism and laissez-faire capitalism, but outside this traditional spectrum altogether. Or that the ideal amount of competition is a moderate amount, rather than none, as all these studies actually indicate. And that brings me to an extremely common fallacy, one we likely encounter countless times a day. That is the anecdotal fallacy. It says when someone uses a personal experience or an isolated example, rather than evidence, in an attempt to substantiate a claim. TZM gets this all the time, for example, when discussing the merits of competition both for economic and psychological flourishing. Despite the evidence being absolutely overwhelming in favor of outgrowing competition in all forms, many feel emotionally connected to the idea and project unsubstantiated anecdotes about how or why it might be beneficial. Often related to the anecdotal fallacy is the appeal to emotion fallacy, which is just what it sounds like, manipulating an emotional response rather than presenting an argument. This usually happens when a claim's truth value challenges a belief we're emotionally dependent on. When criticizing a socioeconomic paradigm, one is bound to run into this all the time. I'll use the prior example again regarding our society's beliefs about competition both in an economic sense and in a psychological sense, which are deeply ingrained dogmatic beliefs. Those who question such dogmatism are often simply insulting without any attempt to provide counter-evidence. The so-called evidence that is presented in refutation is often anecdotal or steeped in emotional bias. And related to emotion-driven fallacies is the argument from personal incredulity. This is when you find something difficult to understand and therefore conclude that it's not true. This is a fairly common dismissal tactic for those who either don't want to or cannot contemplate the magnitude of the social reform we advocate. And lastly, there is the nirvana or perfect solution fallacy. It's a sort of false dichotomy that the person creates by comparing a real-world solution and a utopia, rather than one realistic possibility and another which is merely better. You've all heard this projection, which is commonly uttered by those who wish to frustrate social change or simply have a strong emotional investment in the current system. Any alternative system that is proposed, regardless of its merits, is claimed to be utopian. In reality, a system that embraces the scientific method to solve social problems should be considered the opposite of utopian, and that is practical. I'll stop there with the fallacies, as there are literally dozens more of them. So what's my point with all this? Well, logic is something that most people really never study in school or elsewhere, and as such are often vulnerable to committing logical errors. The monetary culture we live in, with its superficial values of materialism promoted through marketing and advertising, along with the orientation to treat symptoms rather than examine root causes in essentially every institution in society, does everything to reinforce faulty reasoning and deter critical thinking. As such, I wanted to run down a bunch of the most common logical fallacies that inhibit our communication and identify the most common ones we encounter in the Zeitgeist movement. Combined with the semantic and other communicative mishaps I touched upon earlier, I wanted to offer another angle by which to identify and address the objections we get when advocating for such a radical social change. Those of us who discuss the train of thought regularly with new people will find that the most common objections are limited to a small handful with only slight variations. So with an arsenal of understanding that equips you to identify such fallacies within people's objections, it becomes a lot easier to discuss these issues with people and attempt to bridge that difference. Updating our communication strategies to reflect logical and scientific principles is certainly key in advancing our society's values and hence moving us towards a saner future. Thank you very much.
This year's Z-Day main event is taking place in a city that has been proclaimed the entertainment capital of the world, Los Angeles, California. The entertainment industry generates billions of dollars in revenue each year from the production and release of television, film, music, online programming, books, and video games for public consumption. Revenue in the industry increased by 15% from the year 2000 to 2008. The employment sector grew by 20%, and the overall entertainment industry grew at least 50% in a recent decade. There is no question that, just as we discovered in the 1930s, even in a recession or depression economy, people will happily spend a portion of their hard-earned limited income on entertainment. Millions of people worldwide are pouring money into an industry that allows them the freedom to escape from their everyday life. And that's even before you consider the antidepressant revenue generated by the pharmaceutical industry or the underground illegal market of self-medicating substances. There is a very human need represented in these statistics, the need and/or great desire to psychologically escape. I started off my college education training for a career in the entertainment industry as a writer, actor, director, and singer, but shortly after making my start into that world, I had an epiphany that caused me to shift course a bit. The epiphany I had came in the form of these questions. What if instead of creating the perfect escape, we created a better reality? Have we forgotten that we are what we are escaping from and that we have the ability to improve upon it? What if we consciously shaped our society to be healthier and more enjoyable? And as a result of these contemplations, here I am advocating a resource-based economic model. I've titled this presentation, Moving from the Great Escape to an Improved Reality, and I want to begin by posing this question to you, members of the audience, and I don't know if we can up the house lights just a tad for this one. Thank you. What comes to mind when I ask, what do you enjoy escaping from? Take a quick moment to reflect on your own circumstance and consider what applies to you personally. And of those answers that come to mind, pick just one of those for a quick exercise. Now that you have one in mind, one of those things you enjoy escaping from, similar to evaluating personal relationships within a 6 degrees of separation framework, I'd like you to consider just how many degrees that problem you're thinking of is from money, either having money, needing money, or managing money, a degree being a relationship connection. Now, raise your hand if money is 3 degrees or less from what you are escaping from. Keep your hands up only if it is 2 degrees or less from your problem. Keep your hands up if it is 1 degree away or if money itself was part of what you were thinking of. Quite a few. You may notice that just as in the well-known parlor game called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, when it comes to issues we'd like to escape from, money may be perceived as our Kevin Bacon, which may give a whole new meaning to the phrase, bringing home the bacon. This is not at all to suggest that money is evil, but rather to have you entertain the idea that money is a tool used in our current exchange economy whose detriment often outweighs the benefits of its use, both in work reward scenarios and in a greater social context, when compared to what we can technically accomplish using modern advancements in science and technology. In our current market culture, money is considered a valuable commodity in and of itself in a market system where greater value is placed on scarce resources. But consider this. We can technically feed, clothe, and shelter every person on the planet Earth at this point in human development. Ways to meet those particular human needs are not a mystery to humankind in the technical sense, only in the monetary economic sense of resource acquisition. Now, you may have noticed that when I asked you about the money in relation to your problem, I didn't just ask if needing money was related to your problem, I also asked if having or managing money was related to your problem. And some of you may be wondering, when is having money a problem? Especially when money can be used to purchase goods and services that make our life easier. Some people have even affectionately referred to money as survival tickets, and rightfully so. So what can be problematic about having so many survival tickets? This would be a great problem to have, no? Let me start by recounting 2 quick stories. I used to work for a multi-million-dollar investment bankers several years ago, and in this environment, one day, a financially advantaged celebrity confided in me a secret. He was looking particularly depressed, and I asked him if he was feeling okay, and he responded by saying, "Some people think my life is so easy, and in some ways it is, but when it comes to relationships, my life is especially difficult. I never know if the person I'm in a relationship with is with me because they enjoy being with me for who I am, or because of what I can do for them." Fast forward to years later, I'm doing some freelance work for a successful business owner who has made his fortune in the financial services industry. He discovers I volunteer for the Zeitgeist movement, and he becomes vaguely familiar with the model we advocate. He says to me, "I've been thinking about this resource-based economy, and Jen, I have to be honest with you. I really like my stuff. I worked so hard for it, and I really like my stuff." And I said, "Well, you can keep your stuff. Nobody wants to take your stuff in a resource-based economy because they already have access to the best of what they need. But let me ask you this, even with all your stuff, how are your relationships since you made your fortune?" Insert a long pause. He says, "I think you got me there. Now that you mention it, I think I lost one of my best friends recently because I'm doing so much better financially than she is. And our last conversation was really awkward. She seems so frustrated that I'm afraid she'll never talk to me again. And maybe that goes to show what kind of a friend she is. But I don't think there'd be an issue if she was also doing well financially, or if I wasn't doing so much better than she is." With these examples, and as we move on, I want you to consider an underlying theme of social inequality and the ways this inequality is ultimately costly to all of us as individuals and society. I had a great-grandmother who was known to say, "If everyone swept their own porch, the whole town would be clean." This echoing the idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand of free market capitalism, suggesting that if everyone simply motivates themselves to care for their own needs as individuals, then society as a whole will be automatically taken care of as if by an invisible hand. It sounds easy enough, doesn't it? However, if my great-grandmother were alive today, I might ask her how the simplistic porch sweeping metaphor, the one that suggests an equal amount of sweeping per household, accounts for people born into homes with dirt porches, or people having to move to a home with a dirt porch after a corporate workforce reduction. What the invisible hand theory fails to acknowledge, or fails to even seek out, are the true root causes of social outcomes, such as poverty, crime, disease, drug addiction, and environmental instability. In a competitive market system, there is an inherent profit motive for creating and mass-producing goods as cheaply as possible. The benefit may seem to serve the cost-conscious consumer and the business owner alike in a happy win-win scenario. Where's the win when the product is nuclear energy and the cost-conscious measure was a cheaply made and maintained nuclear plant in Japan on the verge of a large-scale technical failure that threatens people's lives and the general stability of the planet's ecosystem? How expensive did cheap just get? And who ultimately benefits from that? No one. This is the world we are living in now. It's not ponies and apples and bread and mittens and lanterns anymore. And we need an updated system that is conscious of this interconnection by design. Money has been considered by the free market advocates to be a great equalizer, probably because it does allow for far more flexibility of exchange than barter, but mostly because of the erroneous notion that money serves mankind as a tool of equalizing democracy. It is perceived that we are voting with our dollars and thus directly forwarding the progress of the best goods and services for us as individuals and thus also all of humankind. But here's where that particular market system vision falls short of reality and moves into the realm of mythology. It presumes consumers start out with the same amount of votes or money. It presumes consumers are omniscient, knowledgeable enough to always properly evaluate what is best for them in the short and long term. It presumes business owners and advertisers with huge profit reward incentive to mislead consumers would never actually do this. It assumes the best possible quality is always a factor in a purchase decision instead of perhaps quality relative to limited choices that fit budget restrictions. It assumes that the people who have made the most money in society have rightfully earned it by public purchase consent related to their high-quality goods and services. And unfortunately, as consumers in today's monetary system, our actual freedom of choice is limited by our purchasing power. And there is no equalizing democracy with our money, and Adam Smith's invisible hand is in fact so invisible, we cannot observe any evidence to support its existence. As human beings, we start out with the same basic life needs, biological and physiological needs, safety, belongingness, and love needs, self-esteem needs, the needs behind the things we hope money can buy us. And if we're all motivated to alleviate and satiate these needs, and we all have a supposed equal opportunity at doing so, how is it that some end up accomplishing this easily and some don't accomplish it at all? Are there cause and effect patterns that can be detected? Are there conclusions that can be drawn from the feedback of these patterns? Yes. And here's where we move from seeking a great escape from reality to consciously creating an improved reality. And these are characteristics of a resource-based economic model. Number one, no money or market system, not even a barter or exchange system in that sense. Money is not a need, it's merely a route to a need, an abstraction conceived by men to presumably make life easier, but we can move past that now. Automation of labor, machines doing the jobs that machines can do, freeing people to contribute to society in ways they enjoy contributing. This places automation innovation in a position favorable to humans, as opposed to the current one where technology replaces jobs. Technological unification of Earth via a systems theory approach. Strategic access in place of personal property. For example, you have access to the best of what you need when and where you need it, instead of everyone owning and storing individual goods. Self-contained, localized city and production systems. The scientific method as the methodology for governance, the proven current best solutions are implemented instead of solutions based on popular opinion of elected officials. What I like most about this strategic access model is that the reward for exploitation is removed, offering no reward incentive to gain from exploiting another person. But wait, not so fast. You may say, what about the human nature of competition? Wouldn't that thwart any effort for such a unified systems approach? While many argue today the specifics of the nature versus nurture debate, from blank slate behaviorism to genetic determinism, it has become clear, at a minimum, that our biology, our psychology, and our sociological conditions are inexorably linked to our environment we inhabit, both from the standpoint of biological evolution to short-term biases and values we absorb from our environment as part of our cultural evolution. Consider that indeed humans are competitive when it comes to obtaining desired resources that are scarce. But when resources are plentiful, there is no natural advantage to compete. But wait, what if I don't want to be a part of any global system and you can't force me to? When I run into people who are adamantly opposed to some global access system being imposed on them, I remind them first that they're already in a global system that is imposed on them, the monetary system. And then I remind them that participation in a resource-based economy would be voluntary, and that the implementation of these ideas is not contingent upon having the approval of every single person on the planet to get a global system started. I also then proceed to secretly wonder if these same folks, when they are apartment hunting or house hunting, when they walk into a prospective new place and see that it is pre-equipped with plumbing for running water, toilet facilities, electric wiring, and perhaps a cable hookup, they are equally bothered by the imposition of the assumed desire for those basic provisions as they have been built into the said infrastructure. It's so outrageously oppressive, isn't it? But wait, what about incentive? Without money, only relying on volunteers, what's to stop people from becoming lazy and taking advantage of other people's labor? A couple of points to that. Studies show that repetitive, mundane jobs lend themselves more to traditional if-then rewards such as money, whereas money doesn't seem to motivate people in jobs that involve innovation and creativity. And you can read more about those studies in the book, The Upside of Irrationality by behavioral economist Dan Ariely, or the book Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us by Daniel Pink. Repetitive and mundane jobs also happen to be the easiest jobs to technologically automate. Without money as an obstacle in a resource-based model, jobs people don't want to do will simply be automated, while jobs that involve human creativity will involve humans that get a reward from the work itself, volunteers. In a 1992 Gallup poll, more than 50% of American adults, 94 million Americans, volunteered time for social causes at an average of 4.2 hours a week, for a total of 20.5 billion hours a year. And that study was done in an environment where people also have to work for money in order to live. So imagine what type of creative and innovative work you might be excited to contribute to if your needs were met at a high standard of living. Consider that the laziness that people fear might occur, behavior that we do see in our current market system, is actually a behavioral response to not having the freedom to choose work that would be quite satisfying to that person while they still have their basic needs met. Even the model of education would be revolutionized in a resource-based economic model in that, for example, instead of a person learning a foreign language, in order to earn a suitable grade, to put toward a degree certificate that will be used to obtain a job, that will be used to obtain income, that will be used to live. In a resource-based economic model, the reward for learning another language might be that you learned another language. As a skill you desired to acquire, of course. Revolutionary. But at the heart of the questions about incentive and concern about the potential of laziness, there is a familiar theme, that of inequality. It wouldn't be fair if one group of people did the work while another group benefited from rewards of that group's labor, and it isn't fair. But it's how the existing market system operates, isn't it? Business owners own the fruit of their labor force who, after a long day's work, still only own their labor. Many people are laboring for something they aren't emotionally invested in, working merely for survival tickets, working to earn their living instead of being able to live their living. In the book, The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger, Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson lay out the results of 30 years of research comparing countries with both low and high income inequality. Essentially, the size of the gap between the richest and the poorest of those countries, to see how the size of that gap possibly correlated to other health and social variables such as life expectancy, murder rate, prison population, poverty rate, trust, obesity, social mobility, math skills, and literacy. And to sum up their findings, the smaller the gap, the better off the society appears to be in the social and health categories. And yeah, that's the USA in the far corner. Yeah. A resource-based economic model involves a design dedicated to eliminating such social stratification altogether through a strategic access model. The Zeitgeist movement's pursuit is very similar to traditional civil rights movements of the past, and this new extension is about the sharing of human knowledge and our technical ability to not only resolve problems, but to also facilitate a scientifically derived social system that actually optimizes our potential and well-being. We have the ability to consciously create an improved reality, one that we wouldn't be so excited to escape from. And whether or not we successfully create this reality depends on our ability to create a shift in cultural values towards sustainability. Values that acknowledge the link between social inequality, a healthy environment, and our well-being. You don't have to care anything at all about world peace. You don't have to feel a warm and fuzzy love for all of humankind. You don't even have to like other people. You can actually be completely selfish in your desire for a resource-based economy. You just need to understand, respect, and support the undeniable symbiotic relationship between the well-being of others, the well-being of our shared environment, and the well-being of yourself. A resource-based economic model is not any attempt for a fixed utopian reality. There will still be problems, just new problems, but a move towards a consciously improved reality that is continually updated using science and technology for social concern, simply the next intelligent evolution for humanity. And I'll leave you with this.
You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you began to ask the question, who owns the oil? You began to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You began to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? What I'm saying to you this morning, communism forgets that life is individual. Capitalism forgets that life is social. The kingdom of brotherhood is found neither in the thesis of communism nor the antithesis of capitalism, but in a higher synthesis. It's found in a higher synthesis that combines the truths of both. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together.
This concludes my presentation.
Well, hi. So, I want to get off this rock for a little while. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at global sustainability from a unique perspective. Of course, being the science techno-geek person that I am, having worked with the space shuttle and somewhat immersed in a lot of the technological references that enable an RBE to exist in the first place, I decided to take this venture from Mars to Earth, kind of going a different way. When you think about space exploration, it's usually the other way around, right? Going from Earth to somewhere. Well, let's flip it. So space exploration and sustainability, what is that all about? Well, when you do anything in space, it is inherent into the system that you need to be sustainable. There is no Walmart, thank God, in orbit. So you kind of sort of want to plan accordingly to maximize the efficiency of, I don't know, the International Space Station or shuttle missions or Dragon missions from SpaceX or whatever the case may be. So what you do in this case is let's do a Mars-based thought experiment and kind of isolate some of the variables that would be the most important and most relevant to living on a hostile world that wasn't really designed for us. Basic necessities of life. All right, well, air, food, water, sleep, medical care. So then you ask yourself, well, can those be provided in a way such that the astronauts don't have to be the stewards of their own habitat all day long? In fact, any researchers going to Mars, their job is not to be the maid of their building. It's to go out and drive and explore and dig up dirts and rocks and I don't know, right? So you would want to make sure that everything you put into their habitat is as automated as possible, sustainable as possible, self-correcting as possible. And that falls into the shelter, clothing, education, energy, transportation, and communication aspect as well. Shelter's kind of a funny one, right? Yeah, on Earth we can, clothing too. Technically you can walk around naked under the stars and you'll be perfectly fine unless it's winter in New England. But on Mars, can't quite do it that way. Your shelter is a life preserver in and of itself because of the Martian atmosphere. Your spacesuit is a life preserver for the exact same reason. And so some of that is also built into a sustainable aspect. So let's say something breaks on my spacesuit and I need to rapidly knock off a part. Do I want to bring a whole bunch of parts with me that have mass and require bigger rockets to get up there and whatnot? Or do I bring a 3D printer and just kind of knock off what I might need in the interim? And so when you're looking at space exploration, something to consider is abundance. Having more than enough to suit the needs of the region, and by far, probably one of the most important aspects for us to live peacefully. And I typically tell this story, and most people can resonate with it. We have a room full of people here, and if I put you all on a stranded island with one coconut tree, no matter how awesome you think you are and how peaceful you are, at some point, you're probably going to come to blows because there just isn't enough. And so negative behaviors are going to manifest. But if I put all of you on an island with just an abundance of coconut trees and food resources and whatnot, you're not going to have a need to behave that way. So you would also do that, obviously, in any space exploration mission, but it would also translate back home. But in space, we have technical abundance. You can't really farm the land on Mars. And so you need to have certain ways in air creation, being able to have breathable air, water recycling systems and whatnot. It's all done through technical means. And so it's the ability to produce an abundance with the minimum human labor input. Goes back to the point of what do you want your astronauts doing all day? What do you want your researchers doing all day? And so in order to give them the time to go do the awesome stuff that they got educated to go do in the first place, it's an absolute necessity on a Mars base. So, from Mars to Earth, let's reverse gears. All right. Can we do that on Mars? Yeah, we can. In fact, we've had NASA and other space exploration institutes have had designs and plans on the books for moon bases, for lunar bases, and Mars bases for quite some time. And I mean 30, 40, 50 years. Some of it rudimentary. We're even better now than we were then, but the concepts are still sound. So if we can do that there, why aren't we doing it here? So what I'm going to do in the interest of time is to isolate two key examples, just something to think about. Biological need of food and a quality of life need of energy. Energy is an amazing thing. If you look at the development of human civilization throughout time, harnessing energy is by far the dominant characteristic that changes our quality of life. So let's look at technical abundance for food. You have hydroponics, aquaponics, sciences that are relatively new in some respects as far as our ability to apply reasons why this stuff works, technical know-how, technical capabilities that allow us to grow without the need of using soil at all. Then you have self-sustaining systems that can regulate with sensors and monitors, pH balance adjusters, things like that, to make sure that the water is great for the plants and the fish. Clean energy power systems, going back to which I'm going to touch on in a bit, and it can be highly automated. Now, I'm not saying that such systems would be completely void of human interaction, But then again, they don't have to be. You're going to have people that want to trim the tomato plants, that enjoy getting in there into the plants and stuff. So it's not so much that we have to automate all of it. That's it. That's what we have to do, like some dictatorship. It's about automating as much as we can so that the person who is the agriculturist that just loves to grow spinach or whatnot can go in there and just do the minimal things that they want to do and then spend the rest of the day hanging out with the kids or enjoying life or learning something and really reinvigorating that whole family unit that seems to be disintegrating a lot these days. And then you look at our clean energy needs. No, I don't want to say that. Far too many people actually don't understand the clean energy potential that we have on this planet. This planet is bombarded on a regular basis by a boatload of energy from the sun. We have wind, we have wave, tidal, hydro, geothermal, ways of harnessing energy. And it's not like free energy as if it comes from some invisible ether. All you're doing is converting from one form to another. And we're getting really good at converting Earth's energy potential into something we can use. So you have ideas like this where you take vertical axis wind turbines and put them on the light posts that your electric car would drive by, for example. You zip by at 60 miles an hour and somebody else zips by at 60 miles an hour, that little wind turbine is going to haul ass spinning. And what's it going to do when it does that? Generate power, which is going to charge a battery on the bottom, and then at nighttime, what's going to turn on the light? The battery that was charged by the people who drove by during the day. No grid. The whole pole runs itself. So if we implemented abundant solution sets for our most basic needs, there's the question, isn't it? Now, of course, most of the people in the room probably know the answer to this one. Can the current socioeconomic system we live in now actually handle such robust global sustainability? No. It was never designed to. It served a purpose to get us to where we are, right? I akin it to this. Are you bitter or mad at the pants you used to wear when you were 9 years old? No. When you were 9 years old, the pants served a purpose, right? They fit you, they worked, and then you outgrew the pants. So we need new pants. All right. So what do we have now? System based on scarcity, what we're moving towards. And this is a very organic movement. Yes, the Zeitgeist movement is a representation of a train of thought that a lot of people cling on to. And there are other groups and organizations, and it's like the whole world, not the whole world, but a good chunk of the world is starting to wake up. I blame the internet a lot because now we're able to share information in such a way that people are going, what the fuck are we doing? We have a system based on inefficient human labor. Let's go to technical labor to cover most of the labor need. Cyclical growth and consumption on a finite planet. That's a brilliant idea. Let's be a bunch of bacteria in a petri dish and grow and grow and grow, and then when we reach the maximum size of the petri dish, we die. Because that's what happens. Science people, wake up. And so when you look at the finite carrying capacity of the Earth, it would make sense to manage what you're doing and limit that whole growth forever thought process. A system based on ownership and control is what we have now. We know we're all moving towards usership and open access, open source of information and ideas, even blueprints and thought process, 3D printers, the list goes on. Outdated, multi-century old ideologies and institutions. I think that has been hammered pretty good up to this point by the great speakers before me. We need a forward-thinking, adaptive, and emergent train of thought in society that says just because it worked yesterday doesn't mean that it's going to work tomorrow. Like the sciences do, keep punching at your theories until they break. And then when they break, go, sweet, now I have a better idea. We have a system based on hostile competition, secrecy, and differential advantage. What we need is a more cooperative, collaborative system of ideas for information and mutual benefit. And then political opinion, yay, politics, dictate the ebb and flow of global operations, including corporate influence on government. And quite obviously, that's not a very good idea for moving forward. So mankind needs to upgrade its global OS, its operating system. So you can call it an RBE, a natural Earth, a Star Trek economy, what the hell ever else you want to call it, doesn't matter. There's a lot of different names for the same general concept. Just remember this. There are no utopias. And as you notice, there's kind of a theme with this no utopia thing. There are always going to be problems and things to tackle. I don't know, like building that Mars base. That's going to be a pain in the ass. It's going to be great. It's going to be fun. It's going to be challenging. It's going to cause us to rethink all kinds of ways of doing things. So there are going to be challenges. So you're going to need new tools and new ways of thinking. And I akin that back to the utopian idea to the hunter-gatherers of 50,000 years ago. Try to explain today. Just try to explain air conditioning. Or they're going to call you a utopianist. Like, wait, I can sit in one building all day and call that my home and go to a store that has all kinds of stuff and it's shipped all over. And what the hell's the internet? And what's that phone? Satellites? What? Okay, the list could go on for a really long time. So transitioning, how do we get there from here? I love the transition question, right? Transition, I want an itemized 1 through 27 list of exactly what we're going to do. You can't even do that looking through history at transitions that happen, that we know happened because they frickin' happened, you know, and agricultural to industrial, whatever. It's a piecewise meal of several functions and variables. I could probably do calculus on the damn stuff. But the point is that it's a very emergent, flowing, nebulous move from one thing to the other. But in short, it's an erosion process. It's basically reducing the dependency on the current system and helping to improve or move to a different way of thinking and doing things. And there's a lot of ways that people can go about doing this, from joining a group or a network, starting their own corporately social responsible company that's kind of a hybrid between, it's like a monetary company, but it's got an RBE brain behind it, so the point is to kind of drive yourself out of business in the long run. You kind of play the game now, and then you eventually say, good, now I don't have to worry about doing that anymore. Something like that. Start or work for a nonprofit that can kind of do the same thing, but also work with what you're passionate about. Don't email me saying, I'm going to be an engineer because I think that's the best thing to do. Are you going to be an engineer because that's what you want to do, or because that's the best thing you think that needs to be done? If you happen to be a musician or an artist or whatever, do that. Don't just become something because you think that's what needs to be done in that respect. I don't think you're going to do yourself or anybody else any major favors by just jumping into something because you think it's appropriate. And so a quote to end on. It's always good to have a good quote to end on. Good old Bucky. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete.
Okay, let's get this started. What I'm about to tell you involves the way information is spread. And it will look like I'm talking about myself, but I'm not. Unfortunately, that's the way ideas are passed through people, from people to people. So bear in mind that everything I'm about to tell you came to me from others, and I want to pass them on to you. So today I'd like to tell you a story. It's a story of a movement, a story of an idea, actually, a simple yet powerful, unstoppable idea. And we have to thank some people for this, among which the Zeitgeist movement, of course, the free and open source community, the hackers, the makers, the industrious inventors who are shaping our future. And first, let's take a step back. 2008, a group of people begins to challenge the assumption that labor is a necessary requirement for survival in the 21st century. They claim that automation and the ability of machines to work is increasingly rapidly, and soon we could replace most jobs, if not all of them in the economy, potentially destabilizing the whole system irreversibly. But, I mean, these are just, a fringe minority, a group of extremists. Just look at yourselves. Most people believe this to be just bollocks, nonsense. But then you kind of, you keep seeing headlines like this. US unemployment along economic nightmares continues, and Eurozone unemployment rises to record. And then I have what I call the Kodak story, or the Kodak moment, the once undisputed giant of the photography industry. 90% of the global market in 1976, 145,000 employees in 1984. 2012, net worth of negative $1 billion when it went bankrupt. Why? Because they failed to predict the power of exponential trends when it comes to technology. Same year, 2012, Instagram, digital photography company, 13 employees, acquired by Facebook for $1 billion. Now, it gets even more ironic because Kodak freaking invented digital photography in 1975. They came out with the first commercially available 0.01 megapixel digital camera, but at the time they thought it was a toy, right? It was like a stamp-sized thing. It's like, it's never going to work. Failed to predict exponential trends. And exponential trends are going faster and faster. Foxconn already beginning to replace its workers with robots. Many others are doing the same. And I'm not going to do the whole thing because I already gave talks about this. You can check it out on YouTube. The point is that a year and a half ago, I decided to quit my job and dedicate my life, well, my time up to now, to writing a book that I hoped would inspire people to change their mind about this issue and bring the idea into the public spotlight. So how did it go? Well, the book came out on November 5th. remember. And then I gave talks in some 20 countries, whatever, there's some coverage of that. Brazil, Huffington Post, Forbes magazine, and then TED Vienna. And the video now has more than 200K views. And it's thanks to the amazing linguistic team of the resource-based economy linguistic team that are translating the videos in all major languages. Let's give them a round of applause, guys. So then the topic started to pick up in the mainstream. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize in Economics, open-ed columnist for the New York Times. Here are some of the articles he wrote. Robots and robber barons, and then the rise of the robots, just a month later. And then here, Jeremy Warner, assistant editor of the Daily Telegraph, one of Britain's leading business and economics commentator. Our robotic revolution is just beginning to gather steam. Next, Cory Doctorow, co-editor of Boing Boing. Robots are taking your job and mine, deal with it. And finally, there is my book, Robots Will Steal Your Job, But That's Okay. And here is 2 months later, Wired magazine cover, Robots Will Take Your Job and You'll Be Glad They Did. Now, some have suggested that Wired magazine copied, my book and the cover, and you know what? Frankly, I don't know and I don't care. Okay? Well, that's not the point. The point is that you shouldn't get attached to your stuff because guess what? It's not your stuff. It's ideas. Okay? Once they're out there, they're not yours. Ideas are spreading. That's what matters. So, and why do I think that? Because ideas speak loudly. They speak louder than myself, louder than any single one of you, louder than anyone else. Because you see, and I quote, "Beneath this mask there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask there is an idea, and ideas are bulletproof." Okay, some of you know I graduated from Singularity University at the NASA Ames Research Park last summer, and I studied how exponential technologies can help improve the lives of 1 billion people or more in less than a decade. And I've been asked many times if I spoke with gentlemen such as Peter Diamandis or Raymond Kurzweil, and if I exposed the ideas of a resource-based economy to them, and what was the response? How did they, if they changed their mind in some way? So here's what Peter H. Diamandis, founder and CEO of the X Prize, had to say just a few weeks ago.
The median wage is now dropping, adjusted for inflation, and most people looking at it, most economists looking at it, find that it's no longer globalization that's causing the median wage to drop. It's actually technological change. we could presumably see a lot of people not only out of work, but the median wage continue to drop.
Absolutely.
So the question is, who's going to buy the stuff?
It's a fascinating question. Let me answer it in two parts. One, a friend of mine, an SU alumnus, just wrote a book, which I love. The title is Robots Will Steal Your Jobs, But That's Okay. We're going to be fundamentally changing society, and the question is, maybe people don't have jobs. You know, I was joking where I say I'm sort of a libertarian capitalist at heart, but we're heading towards a future of socialism.
And Ray Kurzweil, inventor and futurist, multimillionaire, and director of engineering at Google, not exactly, a communist.
Will actually achieve the goals of communism, to each according to their need, from each according to their ability, through this combination of open source information and with these nanotechnology assembly.
He said, we will deliver the goals of communism from each according to his ability to each according to his needs through open source and nanotechnology. Now, reality check, okay? Come on, let's be realistic. I am not personally responsible for changing anybody's mind. Okay, I am mostly irrelevant. I'm nobody. Yet, things are changing. People are talking. And why? Because of the power of ideas. I didn't come up with this stuff. I was preceded by a lot of people. Like, I don't know, some guy called Aristotle, 2,400 years ago. And I was inspired by many extraordinary individuals, the great men and women that I pay tribute to. And they were inspired by others as well, all the way down, like turtles. As Isaac Newton once said, we stand on the shoulders of giants, which is what he was doing when he adapted that saying from Bernard de Chartres. As Kirby Ferguson states in his most excellent series, Everything is a Remix, the interdependence of our creativity has been obscured by powerful cultural ideas, but technology is now exposing this connectedness. And the most dramatic results can happen when ideas are combined, or as Matt Ridley puts it, when ideas have sex. By connecting ideas together, creative leaps can be made, producing some of history's biggest breakthroughs. And ideas don't belong to anyone. They are free. And we are vehicles for these ideas. Or even better, we are wonderful remix machines. As my friend Jason Silva says, ideas are like organisms. They replicate. They have infectivity and spreading powers. They leap from brain to brain. They compete for the limited resources of our attention. They are what Richard Dawkins calls the new replicator, born from the primordial soup of human culture. And this is what ideas have achieved. They were considered crazy. Our ideas, outrageous, nonsense, just 4 years ago. And now, Paul Krugman and everyone else talks about them. They have become a cultural meme, effectively. Now, where do we go from here? I think we have very different futures ahead of us. And depending on the choices we make today, from now on, just like with the issue of technological unemployment, people have a really hard time imagining what tomorrow could be like until it happens. And then it was obvious, everybody knew all along. And just like that, we have amazing individuals spreading ideas. The First Civilization, a free book about a resource-based economy up on the TZM blog. Waking Up, an open-source collaborative movie about a positive future for humanity. And this is just with respect to the Zeitgeist movement. There are a lot more groups also working towards the same basic goal, that we need to come together. You can take down my light.
There is an entire universe of people out there, countless others, spreading ideas of a positive future. You might call them dreamers, or crazy. You might say that what they're doing is never gonna work, and that we're doomed to fall to our primal instincts. Brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, I'm here to tell you differently. I know that we live in an age of daunting problems. We need the best ideas possible, We need them now, and we need them to spread fast. The common good is a meme that was overwhelmed by the seductive mirage of blind profit and intellectual property. But it needs to spread again. If the meme prospers, our laws, our norms, our society, they all transform. This is social evolution, and it's not up to governments, it's not up to corporations, and it's not up to lawyers. It is up to us. We are the children of 1,000 generations of this human race, and we have come this far not to be subjected to imperialism, conflicts, and deprivation. We are meant for something great. I am here to tell you that with the right mind and motivation, we can achieve anything. We have the technology to feed everyone on Earth. We can escape the prison of working for survival. And we can find a balance with nature. We can do all these and much more, but only if we want to. And now, go and do something amazing.
Thank you.
My name is Jason Lord. I coordinate chapters, which are just awareness activism groups in the state of California, of which we have 15 right now in the state. And there are 8 Z-Day events going on in California this weekend. So to continue this emerging train of thought, my presentation today is on the topics of thinking in systems, a worldview for a natural law-based economy. I find there are 2 angles when communicating these ideas. One is the dominant value program of the culture, where the goal of our awareness activism is to essentially update the cultural mindset and hence the culture's values. The other angle is understanding the actual structure of social operation in regards to the model that we express and how it works. So by now you've heard much on the topic of social values, which also include your personal value set, which is the lens through which you see and interpret the world around you. And my hope today is that you will take with you an alternate lens in which to view the world. This lens being the foundation for the very attainable and currently doable social system the movement advocates. The goal here is to put systems into context when discussing a natural law resource-based economy. I'm going to shorten that down to just say natural law model, so I have to keep repeating that over and over again. Divided this presentation into 4 parts, and they're short parts. So defining systems and language, seeing how systems have behavior, and that'll be interesting. A quick look at 3 broad economic components and what life need means, and governance, the sticky topic. So part one, defining systems. The topics I want to cover pose a challenge on two levels, language and relationships. I'm using old language, which is our everyday language, in order to express nonlinear relationships. It's easy to understand linear relationships with old language since two elements can be drawn on a graph showing a simple relationship with constant proportions, whereas nonlinear relationships do not produce a proportional effect and can only be drawn in curves and wiggles. The world is full of nonlinear relationships which can surprise our linear thinking minds. Where we may have learned that a small push produces a small response, it would follow in linear thinking that a larger push, twice as big, would produce twice as big as a response. But in a nonlinear system, twice as big a push could produce a fraction of the response, a response magnitude larger or no response at all. So with that in mind, for the next 4 hours, we will look at hundreds of graphs, lots of mathematical formula, and enough of that crap. So, a system is not just a collection of random things. It is an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something, consisting of component parts, interconnections, function, or purpose. For now, it will suffice to see systems as a set of components interconnected in such a way that their relationship is greater than the sum of the parts. Central to understanding systems, especially in understanding symbiotic relationships, is the concept of feedback. Complex systems have feedback loops that allow for self-renewal and self-organization, such as when you heal from a cut or recover from being sick, or observe the self-organizing complexity of insects and plants, or the cycle of bird migrations around the planet. Feedback is a loop where information of some kind is fed back into the system itself. Whether it's data in a computer, consensus from a population, or a change in the temperature, it is a way a system responds to its environment. So systems thinking is the process of understanding how component parts relate to each other within the whole. Now in nature, systems thinking examples include ecosystems in which various elements such as air and water, plants, animals interact to achieve equilibrium with the environment, hence achieving stasis within the Earth system itself. Systems are not just physical. They can also be comprised of beliefs and political ideologies, or modes of social organization such as monetary structures, systems within systems, both physical and intellectual, all interacting with each other all at the same time. By taking this view, we can study the behavior of systems to know if the outcomes are desired or harmful. Which brings us to part two, systems behavior. Let's take a look at an example, and here's something I think most of you are familiar with. That wonderful toy we call a Slinky. Yes, the Slinky holds the understanding to complex and elegant system that we will call a natural law resource-based economy. If you hold the Slinky in the palm of your hand, nothing happens. If you hold the Slinky by one end, it starts to bounce up and down. Well, this is a great example of systems behavior. And whether you move the Slinky from one hand to the other or throw it back at your friend in frustration, the question to pose is this: what made the Slinky bounce up and down or walk down steps? Or said another way, what causes the resulting behavior? Now, some of you may be figuring out answers like the person's hands did or gravity. Whereas those answers may seem logical on the surface, the answer is actually much more simple. The answer lies within the system that we call a Slinky itself. The hands that manipulate it suppress or release some behavior that is latent within the structure of the spring. This is a central insight into systems theory and understanding our world through this systems lens. Now, we tend not to see in this way. Instead, we focus on the resulting behavior, such as crime, as the problem itself. Fighting crime, fighting the whole list of causes, and go down the list for quite a while, rather than understanding such outcomes as latent behavior inherent in the system structure. When it comes to Slinkies, systems behavior is easy enough to understand, but when it comes to economics, class, nations, or other established systems, it's not so simple. But once we see that there is a relationship between structure and behavior, we can begin to understand how systems work, how some work well, and how others do not work well at all, manifesting latent behaviors inherent to those systems, each producing different outcomes in the social landscape. So let's look at some part of our current social structure using the lens of systems thinking. Some things that come to light when taking on this worldview are: political leaders do not cause recessions or economic booms. Ups and downs are inherent in the structure of the market economy itself. Competitors rarely cause a company to lose market share. The losing company creates its losses through its own business policies, while the competitor is there to scoop up the advantage. Oil exporting nations are not solely responsible for oil price increases. Price spikes and economic chaos are results of oil importing nations building economies that are vulnerable to supply interruptions. The flu virus does not attack you. Rather, you set up the conditions for it to flourish within you. And as a final example, criminal behavior. Locking people up who are deemed criminal only swells prison populations. It does nothing to address what is causing the behavior in the first place. Statements like these can seem unsettling, for it starts to shift the focus from the resulting behavior to the system structure itself. And you're going to come up against this when you talk about the movement to people. Now, there are many ways to see the world. So much of what we think about along the lines uses language that only lives in the abstract, without having a referent back to the physical life system. Whereas our ability to observe, test, collect feedback, and try again has brought us out of the dark ages to where we are today. And this is why the Zeitgeist Movement is interested in the scientific method as applied to our sustainability as a species. When you look through the lens of a systems worldview, the method of science is not restricted in its application to the physical world. It can also be applied to our social systems, to our economics, or our educational system, and as a method of understanding human behavior. And in turn, there is a natural feedback system built into the physical reality, which allows this method to adjust, adapt, and change as needed. And this is what we mean by emergent. Now, I want to distinguish between the scientific method and the science industry. Some people have trust issues with science. And when you look into what people don't trust, it's not really science as in the scientific method they don't trust, but rather the existing science industry. Our science industry has certainly been corrupted through the mechanism of profit incentive, where a corporation might need to force results that enhance the selling of their product. In a 2012 publication from the UCS entitled Heads They Win and Tails We Lose, it outlines how corporations corrupt science through the use of financial pressure, through downplaying evidence and exaggerating uncertainty, corrupting advisory panels, and through their lobbying. In contrast, a resource-based model simply values data that has proven before implementing solutions based on that data. This sets up scientists to truly be able to value the scientific method and embrace information that might make their hypothesis wrong because it serves a greater purpose, allowing us a more accurate understanding of our world. What starts to develop as we follow this train of thought is that our relationship to the world that sustains us is a technical relationship. You'll see the term technical used as synonymous with scientific in our materials. This is better to express the causal nature of existing phenomena and how things are interrelated. You could look at this as spiritual, since the notion of being in harmony with nature or in balance is fundamental to many of the world's religions. And the point is that there is a real technical relationship between us and all the other subsystems nested within each other as part of the full Earth system. So part 3, economics and life need. With the lens of the systems worldview starting to take shape, we can now consider some economic variables, starting with life need. What is human need or life need? Well, the best way I've heard life need expressed is that without which life capacity is reduced. I like this definition since it cuts out a lot of the cultural distortions about what our life needs are. Need is expressed here as distinct from human wants, which relate to the conditioning of your cultural environment, but not directly related to life need. From a technical or a scientific standpoint, there is a spectrum of life need, common to all living human systems on the planet regardless of race, creed, nation, religion, or social class. These needs are noted as atmospheric, physiological, shelter, environmental, social, and vocational. Now, these are broad distinctions which contain the life ground attributes of clean air, nutrition, water, social interaction, and education. This is the empirical life ground that is shared by every human being. When it comes to what we believe about meeting needs, what is generally accepted today is that monetary economics and the free market are the pinnacle of social organization for bringing prosperity to the masses. Well, in order to claim that title from a systems view, you have to account for the whole system. And if we assess what is happening in the current structure, almost half the world, which is over 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day. It's total purchasing power for their life need. And if we climb up the ladder just a little ways, we find that 80% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. So I think we can cut the crap about market economics being the pinnacle. It's nothing more than an assumption at this point. The question we need to ask is, what outcome do we want from our socioeconomic system if the goal is to meet our life needs in the most sustainable way? Well, let's look at this word socioeconomic a little closer, since I keep using it to refer to a type of system. Now remember, I'm using old language to express nonlinear relationships. So if we look at the main component of this word, let's define it from a technical perspective, which is economics derives from the Greek to mean management of a household, with the aim of an economy to actually economize. To economize is to conserve. To conserve is to create efficiency. And what is efficiency? Efficiency is absence of waste. Keep that in mind as I describe attributes of this structure. What is referred to as the efficiency mechanism is inherent throughout a systems approach to social organization. When we consider our relationship to the larger environment, the economic organization of interdependent living systems, us, is through a physical referent to the largest order closed system that contains our life need. In this regard, we refer to the Earth as an essentially closed system since it contains life capacity within its biosphere. This is why we refer to the Earth so much. It's not just a pretty unifying symbol. It is a physical starting point. And from this logic, we see how a very different economic system would result. We are living systems in constant exchange with life resource from an essentially finite Earth. This is the fundamental connection of the human species. And our place in the physical world confirms that we are not separate entities in any respect. We must arrive at a working social model based on this logic if we expect to survive. Now, there are many economic components of a natural law model that I don't have time for today, so I'm only going to touch on three broad components which become self-evident in regards to responsible decision-making. And these are resource accounting, dynamic equilibrium, and strategic design. We have to account for what there is, while taking into account renewal attributes of our resources that we consume, and then being strategic in our designs to maximize efficiency. Now again, the efficiency mechanism is a core attribute to these components. Remember, it's not a separate thing, which can be confusing if you're looking at this from a linear perspective. In regards to accounting, our natural resources and ecosystems are spread throughout the globe, and they work together as a whole Earth system. Each resource and species has a function in preservation, recycling, and a regeneration of life, and are accounted for as system components in a natural law model. We must organize and account for what we have available, and this can be done through scanning and surveying our habitat. Proper economic resource allocation can't really be made unless we have a clear understanding of what we have and where it is. Now, it might seem fanciful to have a survey of the world's resources as part of a global resource management system, and in the current economic climate, I agree with you. But the reality is that we're doing much of this right now. Now, it's not integrated, for there's no reason to do so. We live in a world of patents and secrets and market shares and copyrights. The cooperation needed to create this kind of global system would undermine the need for a monetary system altogether, and it's partly why it's not done. The point here is our ability to measure and survey our world is a current technical reality happening right now. With a quick internet search, it's easy to find other organizations that collect data about our physical world. These groups are not integrated, but they're still examples of the systems model when it comes to surveying, accounting, and analysis. Once we collect data from our survey mechanism, we need to rate each source based on its renewability, the pollution output, and everything that factors in order to weigh the degree of sustainability. Now, this compiling would be done through advanced computer systems since the amount of data to deal with is just far too immense and can only be managed through AI systems. Now, accounting is only a first step. We need to track the rates of change and the regeneration where they apply. This is a simplified example of equilibrium, showing water level in a container. If the inflow equals the outflow, the water level remains consistent and is in a state of equilibrium. Similarly, we have resource inflows into our economic system. There's a stock of materials and goods, and there are outputs to production and distribution of those goods, and is hence a core component of a natural law economy. A classic example of disregard for dynamic equilibrium today is deforestation. Trees have a natural life cycle, and if our use of wood exceeds the rates of regeneration, which is of course what we have today, we have a problem, for it is unsustainable. But this logic applies to all systems and not just our forests. It applies to how we organize our agriculture, food production, traffic systems, going in for the reduction of pollution outputs and fuel consumption, not to mention the utter waste of human life sitting here in LA traffic. And it also applies to the use of our oceans and sustaining our habitats. Now, you can even use this principle when you track groundwater. Observing the dynamic equilibrium of all systems is inherent in a natural law economy. Now remember, the current monetary model requires as much consumption as possible to keep the growing population employed and the market economy operational, which, when accounting for life capacity and systems that produce life need, what we're doing now is complete ecocide. If efficiency is absence of waste, then inefficiency could not be more fully realized than what we have today. And this leads us to strategic design. As we move away from market inefficiency, things will be designed to last. The multiplicity of goods, the stratification of quality, the planned or intrinsic obsolescence would no longer be necessary, since consumption would no longer be the driver of economic activity. It is optimum efficiency, conservation, preservation, through designing everything to be the best that it can be and last as long as it can, producing what is the most technically correct for any given application or need. The waste reduction alone, from producing only the best that is needed without multiplicity, without stratification, or the breakdown of goods, the waste reduction alone would be immense, along with recycling, updating, and the longevity designed into the products that we use. This would be part of the ongoing efficiency mechanism. And in the time I have left, I want to touch on one more often misunderstood aspect of this model: governance. If there was ever a sticky topic, this would be it. Fortunately, it's not that complicated, and here's why. Governance is not to be confused with what we call government. Politics, opinion, private interest, lobbying, and popular vote are used in the process of making policy, enforcing laws through penal action, or imposed restrictions, such as imprisonment. Today, we control human behavior through the enactment of laws without considering the physical or social conditions responsible for producing that aberrant behavior in the first place. Usually, we project a right or wrong value judgment onto the offending party, whether a political leader, a corporation, or another country, and we call that the source of the corruption. A systems approach to governance has nothing to do with centralized power or some mystery group of evil men behind a curtain while the rest of us are enslaved. Such statements are better suited as an accurate metaphor for the system that we live in today. Rather, governance refers to processes that ensure the effective management of a project, organization, or system. Well, which processes? Well, those that are relevant to life need. And what is life need? That without which life capacity is reduced, which brings us back to the spectrum of human needs, which all have a physical referent back to the environment. Next, to ensure effective management. Well, that is to achieve our goals in the most efficient manner possible using the best methods we have, which is currently the method of science. What projects? Well, those systems that produce the goods and services that we need. What organization? Well, that would be our social organization. And which system? Well, that is the socioeconomic system that encompasses all of these attributes. Of course, whatever path unfolds between a monetary system and a natural law economy will most likely involve the need for government and law as we know it. But as new systems are implemented and the production of goods are automated, and as we start meeting the needs of the human population, you will see a drastic reduction in violence, and hence the need for government and laws and enforcement will diminish over time. There is a hierarchy in natural systems, which is quite different from the idea the word conjures up for most of us, where one person or group has power over another. My goal here is to put the concept of hierarchy into context. Here's a simple example, starting with a photo of a tree, or better said, it is a representation of a system that we refer to as tree. There is diversity in the branches, which are subsystems to the tree, and the subsystem of the roots, it also has multiple functions for nutrients and moisture needs. Now, all working together as interdependent and interconnected systems. No voting, no hiring, no firing, no warfare, all components getting what they need, but none with power over the other. This is taken from the National Park Service here in the United States. Here we have a model of systems that make up the Mojave Desert here in California. And to take hierarchy to the next level of complexity, to break this down so it's a little easier to understand, you start at the top and you start with your overall system, your overall framework. And then things break down and are separated out into the main components of the system, each one broken down into its component parts. And then detailed models consisting of the elements is drawn up. And this forms a hierarchy. Now this is looking at a more complex version of hierarchy, but it's hierarchy nonetheless in a natural system. And for a modern day example of a hierarchical structure that works as an extraordinary system, Look no further than the internet. Every computer that is connected to the internet is part of a network. And while it's useful to have simple diagrams like this showing the relationships, rest assured when you look at the totality of the internet system, it is a dynamic, complex, and resilient system. Of course, we need to put this into context as to how people would relate to each other, since that's the big fear about all of this, right? Who's going to be telling me what to do? Well, this fear shows a social aberrancy that gets reinforced in a system where it's hard to trust anyone. The good news is that you get to decide what interests you. This may come as a surprise because many of us are not prepared for the liberating responsibility, since we've been robbed of our ability to contribute by being dumbed down to workers and consumers and saddled by the burdens of debt and stresses of economic inequality. The social structure of a natural law economy is a collaborative one, where people contribute based on their interests and are given the skills to do so through the learning process, where the sharing of ideas and information is not restricted through monetary exchange. This is happening right now through the internet revolution, open source projects, along with countless hours of volunteering done by people worldwide who are not in it for themselves. There is plenty of research that shows how higher levels of happiness and innovation relate to economic equality, and how natural it is for humans to cooperate and contribute outside of the narrow self-interest that we call the profit incentive. Things get done through a cooperative structure known as interdisciplinary teams. Such teams are a collaboration between different disciplines, areas of study, to achieve innovative solutions during the creation process. New tools allow large groups to collaborate in innovative ways by taking advantage of non-financial motivations and by allowing for differing levels of contribution based on the state of technology, skill sets, and knowledge. The connection of these teams and the sharing of knowledge create a unifying data set where the component innovations of everyone add to the quality of life for everyone. In this model, the market is not the exchange of multiplication of money. The real market becomes the market of ideas, built upon through coordinated teams and skills, each adding to the body of knowledge of the whole, and by cooperating with each other rather than competing from self-interest. Remember, behavior is related to the structure when looking at systems. And lastly, there is no more who makes the decisions. Decisions are arrived at through feedback, which we covered earlier, based upon current knowledge, the introduction of newer technologies, the Earth's carrying capacity. A systems approach to problem solving makes use of interdisciplinary teams aided by computer technology, which provide feedback from the environment in order to arrive at the best possible decisions and solutions at that time. To quote Jacques Fresco of the Venus Project, the design must be based on the carrying capacity of the planet, its resources, and the needs of its inhabitants. To sustain our civilization, we must coordinate advanced technology, available resources with a humane systems approach. In the broad view, our public health is the final measure, along with the intelligent management of the Earth, which provides the core resources that we need, and coupled with the social conditions necessary for a healthy society. A society based on concerns designs in and access abundance, a healthy environment, thereby encouraging a new social value, where human needs are met. The mechanism of differential advantage removed, and incentive is created out of knowing that the integrity of the social system is directly related to your own personal integrity. Our world has become more complex. Our traditional methods of problem solving through politics and monetary economics are obsolete. And due to the increasing complexity of our world needs and the problems our lifestyles generate, it's necessary that we strive for a holistic approach to managing our environment. Systems thinking makes it possible for us to update, change, and adapt, and ultimately be an emergent society. Through this lens, we have a wider range of choices before us for what it means to be sustainable and allowing us to seek new opportunities to problem resolution for all humankind. Please join the movement, and I thank you for your time.
Well, hello everybody. Thanks for being here with us. My name is Brandon Christie. The title for this presentation is The Case for Human Unity. The first part will be discussing how unity appears to be a natural progression for us as a species based on the universal dynamic of unity being virtually expressed in all of life, and on the critical role that unity has had in our human evolution. The second part looks at human division, where we basically struggle against each other for survival on a global scale. Part 3, false divisions, a quick part about how the notion of division is a narrow and really false perception of the world, and that our observable human Earth oneness really returns us to reality as the most relevant and productive view to hold. And the fourth section, unity, looks at what the powerful benefits would be of a unified global society as contrasted to today, and then into some closing points. So part 1, progression to global unity. Human unity has been an issue of survival. It's not just a lovely thought. Defined as the state of being one or whole, unity is expressed virtually everywhere in life. The Earth itself is a unified, living, interconnected system made up of interacting parts, attached to and a part of progressively larger unified living system wholes. Cooperation, the act of working together for common gain and achieving more than being on your own, is also widespread throughout nature as a common survival strategy, expressed at many levels of life, from bacteria to living organisms to social structures of birds and insects, and it's universal in mammals. And we know that the evolution of life evolved from this kind of cooperative way at the cellular level when life was just forming on Earth. Inside cells, when the lower competing units of those cells would start to cooperate with each other, cells started to form more and more complex life forms. Now, competition, the struggle between and within species for survival, is also widespread throughout nature as a means of survival. Cooperation and competition are the activism of life to survive. And it's no surprise that our social mode has been based on these two varying roles throughout our evolution. Today, competition is the basis for our social structure in what we call the competitive market system. But our capacities for cooperation and unity are ever present. Cooperation has its roots, obviously, in the early stages of our evolution. The culture of cooperation was a very successful survival strategy, and we owe our evolution to our pro-social abilities to work together in communities. It benefited us to help each other as support was lent back, creating a mutually supportive group team. Not only did this social unity work for us, but our very human biology is wired for it. The more connected we feel to others, the healthier and happier we are. Culture in general is full of evidence of this need to be connected, from the social media phenomenon to public events. And if you look around, there's kind of like this social nature to everything that we do. Through our early evolutionary cooperative behavior, our young species succeeded, and in time, populations increased. As populations increased, another major driver of human evolution that has continued to shape our values and cultures today is technical innovation. From early stone and bone tools to early farming and agriculture, to early developments in transportation and energy harnessing, to the Industrial Revolution that transformed our economy at the time, to the modern day of space exploration and the global internet, technology and awareness has always resulted in increasingly more connected, more interdependent paradigms that conform to the technical reality and awarenesses of the times. Human society has changed greatly over time as our advancements continue to connect us in larger and larger ways, where we are now more and more a unified, interdependent world community. Now, harm done in one part of the world affects the entire population. And with that basic realization, we now find that one's personal world of survival becomes strangely and ironically self-sabotaging, because at the end of the day, we all directly or indirectly influence society, which influences us. So it is more and more now in all of our self-interest to have a responsibility for the obvious reciprocal roles that we have in society. Throughout our evolution, one's survival, activism, and awareness could only afford to extend to one's family or community at the exclusion of outsider groups. As we gained experience in the world and got better at surviving, communities grew, but survival was crude, resources were scarce, and the social environment was still competitive, setting the stage for the competitive division paradigm we exist in today. Part 2, division. Human society is based on a multi-level division and competition from the local and global level, consisting of nation states, race, creed, social class distinctions, giving this illusion that we are all inherently different and that we should act upon that perspective, when in fact we share only a common human experience. Given this historical divisionary view, along with the environmental scarcity that has really always been with us, it's easy to see how we built our economic approaches and philosophies around this view, where humanity today still struggles essentially against itself, an advanced form of competing for survival. This divisionary mode of interaction is no longer relevant to us in the modern day, carrying with it major consequences such as scarcity, war, crime and corruption, inefficiencies, environmental harm, a hostile social environment, and serves as a great hindrance to our human progress. Here's a quick overview of some of these consequences. War. War is an age-old tradition, fetish of dominating over each other out of fear, yet at the same time, this pattern is being really provoked by the very nature of our still survivalist social mode itself, where control over land and resources still equate to group advantage and hence ensured survival. War is also a profitable industry, bringing in about $1.5 trillion annually, further reinforcing the pattern. The applications of modern technology, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence to warfare makes it increasingly easier and quicker to kill ourselves in greater numbers. This kind of destructive power really threatens the whole planet now that we all share, making it all the more critical that nations learn to find common ground for mutual benefit to actually achieve the goal of peace. Crime and corruption, mainly motivated by the need to survive regardless of the social and environmental costs, whether it's scavenging for food, recyclables, or it's stolen property, or it's the highest corporate crimes. The lines of what's legal or right are blurred up and down the scale as the divisionary structure of human economic interaction is based on this doing whatever's necessary to make it. Inefficiency. Competing and not working together is inefficient from a fundamental standpoint, putting a drain on valuable resources and energy overall, causing much more injury and loss than good. The economic operations of our human division and competition today, as expressed in these pictures, are extremely inefficient. Production and distribution of goods are non-localized. When you look at it, it's non-streamlined, shipped from long distances, crisscrossing all over the planet. Transportation systems are a mess. Our methods for harnessing and converting energy is inefficient and really dirty. There are hundreds of millions of undernourished people in the world, and at the same time, there's hundreds of millions of overweight people in the world, a severe imbalance and inefficiency. There's also a great waste of time, which is really valuable, where people literally sit in hours of traffic a day, people waiting in lines and the general navigating of the needless complexity of modern day society. Environmental harm. With such inefficiencies naturally comes environmental harm and waste, with rampant pollution to our soil and water, our atmosphere, with also noise and light pollution, all outcomes of a divisionary competitive structure where individuals and businesses have to attain and maintain a profit as priority out of return. Social hostility. Our environment is hostile at the social and macro levels with the pressures and stress that comes with having to prove your worth daily in a competitive environment, and with the inherent social class inequality that is structured right in to our economic model, where some literally have less right to life than others. This unfair and unnecessary structural violence is a major source of crime, stress, and behavioral conflicts in general. World division and competition greatly hinders progress as successes, ideas, new technology, new information are not shared but are restricted by competitors for advantage. New improvements that can benefit all of society are literally restricted and withheld and protected. With division and competition and scarcity and trade and exchange comes naturally this thing called cost, which is very, very limiting, where as a species we are literally unable to afford our own progress. Stepping back here from a purely technical standpoint, just looking at the Earth, a resource-abundant, humane global system that ensures the quality of life for everyone is a reality. It's really no longer technically necessary or rational to compete against each other as a world society as we do today in our economic traditions. It is only reasonable to unite globally and harness the global potential. Part 3, false divisions. Divisions are obviously false. Distinctions are made only for the sake of communication. The Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, a unified, interconnected system, as Jason was describing, consisting of many interacting life systems. There's a physical order to the natural Earth environment in which all species interact. This common ground experience virtually transcends all notions of cultural division. Since our survival and quality of life as a species depends upon how well we interact with the natural world based on our emerging understanding of it, our worldview and economic methods should always be applied in the most relevant and encompassing context that we can observe. From this perspective, nation states and other widespread social divisions are clearly arbitrary and false divisions, and we can acknowledge and respect this reality that we are a single species community trying to make it on a planet in space and harness this community potential to the benefit of all of us or not. Part 4, unity. Our future is world unity, one of positive interdependence, holding great possibilities for future sustainability. As we evolve out of our long assumed default mode of division and competition and begin to harness our collectivity, developing a world system that reflects that potential and that reflects our growing understanding of both ourselves and the Earth, a very different world emerges where many of the conditions that motivate and are the main cause of problems today would simply not exist, structurally or socially. By collectively applying our current potentials for harnessing clean energy, applying automation to labor, and setting up networks for high-speed transit and a cooperative, unified world economy that could easily meet the life needs for our global population at a high level, energy and resource abundance would become a reality, and eliminating the need to engage in the false life system of financial exchange, gone with its many consequences and irrelevancies. In a unified world, true security and peace could obviously never really come from retaliatory cycles of violence and force and intimidation, but can only come from a global solidarity, a global consciousness, right? Patriotic loyalty to one's homeland is really inward and exclusive, rooted in superiority and fear, which only fuels tensions between the people of the world, not cohesion and peace. Global unity would be efficient, as working together transcends the dysfunctional barriers of affordability. Economic methods of transportation, production, distribution of goods, energy, harnessing, could all be optimized directly based on what's technically possible, not financially possible. People's awareness and concern could now shift from one's own personal world of survival to that of the global society, fostering truly sustainable environmental awareness. Social unity creates well-being and synergy. Division creates clash and stagnation. In closing, competing against each other is a primitive survival mode, characteristic of an early stage of evolutionary development, with no relevance to empathic, cooperative, modern-day human society with the scientific awareness and technology that can support the entire human population. Our evolution from small communities to being progressively connected in larger social organizations implies a new global age, and with the ongoing consequences of human division, a move to unity is not just a natural evolutionary progression, but as a pressing necessity of the times. The Zeitgeist movement is a worldwide response to this imperative for unity. The movement recognizes that a shared global consciousness is an essential step towards this. Its activism in part seeks to unify the human family through this basic perspective that we all share this planet and that all nations must disarm and learn to share resources and ideas if we expect to survive in the long term. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I come with great tidings of joy.
from the UK. They all say hi and they say they love you. And I'm going to broadly talk about public health, which has been touched upon actually very helpfully by Brandon and Jason, and to some extent by Peter as well. So I call this public health, historical and modern value conflicts. So of overriding importance to any society's security and integrity is the integrity and development and flourishing of its own public health. This is true whether we define that society as a village community, a city, a nation, or the aggregated global population. As referenced here, public health doesn't just mean physical health of individual humans within that collective, that being broadly the body's ability to cope with and react to invasive infection or disease, and to build up a library of immunity, if you like, of known illnesses. But on a wider level, the social level of public health should be considered as an aggregated immune response system of a society itself. On this level, public health could be broadly characterized as the ability of a society to recognize, prepare for, and defend against larger survival and life quality threats to its structure and to its population's own functional integrity. So the broader system of public health integrity encompasses many interlocking levels, not all of them strictly medical or scientific even. Those that are medical include, of course, research and development of treatments known and existing ailments, preventive healthcare efforts such as checkups on national or local levels, genetic research to predict family or group immunities or predispositions to certain illnesses, and the broad coordinated sharing of information about disease and communicable ailments and so forth. Particularly with reference to common health threats, the modern science of epidemiology can be traced back to the emergence of the priority of public health as a broad issue in London around the 1800s. At this time, large urban populations began to amass, and so the necessary safeguards for close proximity living and health stability needed to be ensured for the continuance of the rapidly growing cities. Epidemiology as a science and public health as a priority set are implicitly modes of plurality, the sort of models of plurality. They exist as sort of layers of societal logic based on environmental feedback and the goal of group stability. Their successful effects are the generalized improvement of all, not based on class or arbitrary division. Data is collected and contributed to by the many for the many. And then there are the sort of less direct medical factors of culturally promoted lifestyle, both of the dominant consumption habits and individual choices, which, as Brandon also said, also comes from the society. And levels of exercise, the level of stress which is borne upon by the population, and so forth. On the more oblique levels are matters of sort of healthcare policy, the value placed on availability of systems of public health and well-being, and initiatives directed at solutions to health issues, housing, work environments, and all, and which are all, of course, essentially imbricated with the overall psychosocial culmination of what becomes general public health. Of course, much of this collective support can be made totally redundant by a few economic and social premises which prioritize values in a manner contrary to the logic of shared and generalized systems. For example, if a society's economic factors have the effect of determining that the availability of health-enhancing treatments or non-stressful lifestyles are only available to a particular class or set of classes, the groundwork upon which public health and epidemiology rests actually just falls at the first hurdle. Or if a known impending danger to a society is ignored in favor of business interests, then there is no public health system at all, since any preventative responses or precautions are essentially rendered null and void by their non-implementation. And this is actually true even if there is a general recognition that social health priorities are important. In fact, if you've sort of been nodding your head quietly this whole time that I've been speaking, thinking that this all sounds rather obvious, it's because there isn't really anyone who doesn't think that the arena of public health isn't in some way integral to the function of the logic of a society. The last general point here I want to make is at the outset, true systems of public health integrity also differentiate themselves from, and are in fact, I think, set against the so far dominant competitive market model of human social operation, as well as the dominant way in which we think about rights and entitlements for members of society, and those differentiate themselves in a few important ways. So public health is about a different kind of human right. We often hear talk of the freedom of the press, freedom of speech,
freedom to assemble, freedom of dissent, and so on. The resulting impact of optimal and successful public health actions are conversely freedoms from. Freedom from disease, freedom from regular food poisoning, freedom from the early corrosion of your nerves through socially imposed stress, for example. Freedom from violent attack by psychosocially wounded individuals driven to dissonance with their society through unmet needs and value distortions. Freedom from dying of cholera yesterday, okay? These freedoms are marked by an absence of a negative retroaction, rather than an ability for a particular action to take place, like the freedom to assemble, for example, which you do so well in the US with the freedom of speech zones. Sorry, we're the same. The effects of public health are felt in the promotion of an improved standard of physical and mental health. They are the results of preventive health. Now, in this sense, the benefits can seem a little invisible within public discourse, especially in a society that reinforces and rewards behavior through a series of positives or if-then scenarios. If you work, you will get paid. Work hard and you'll get a raise, or maybe extra holiday or a promotion. Work extremely hard and wear a suit every day and you'll get the Republican nomination, and so forth. Avoid working hard or well, and you would be forfeited your security. Break a society's rules and you'll be imprisoned, and so on. Given these different criteria of results and priorities, it may not be that surprising that, and this is where I'm going to lose every free market advocate who might accidentally be watching this video, but systems and social constructs which encourage public health and a generalized approach towards the promotion of functional life requirement are not achieved by the general free market activity at all, ever. Okay? Nor are they encouraged or enabled by them. In fact, public health as a discipline arose precisely because the laissez-faire attitude to social operation and the uncoordinated function of activity limited and even completely ignored the ability to avoid health dangers. If the priority set is profit-based or based on a particular power distortion generated by vested interest motivations, social interest is placed second. That is, it is not a factor at all. Now, history shows an almost constant battle between the sort of slowly emerging arena of public health and the inhibiting forces of poor public and academic education, a lacking awareness or understanding of various environmental effects by society in general, and of course, the ever-present business interests of the time. I'll borrow a few stories from Victorian England, which is the era that actually sort of birthed modern public health. The major plank in this era was the fight against the spread of cholera. So, the deadly strain of Asiatic cholera came to Britain in late 1831 and caused devastation and death for many years after, bringing with it the riots that had accompanied the outbreaks in Russia and elsewhere. British medical professionals had actually known about this new strain of the disease from reports that preceded its advance from the point of origin it had in Bengal, taking as it did about 15 years to spread across the Middle East and Europe before finding its way onto a ship which docked at Sunderland Port in North England. Now, it is already this early in the story of the Victorian cholera epidemics that we find one of the many examples of the value war between established societal power and the efforts of preventive healthcare and social immunity. At the time of the impending and expected epidemic, King William IV himself stated that he had directed that all the precautions should be taken which experience has recommended as most effectual for guarding against the introduction of so dangerous a malady into this country. One of the precautions was a 15-day quarantine of vessels entering from the Baltic to Sunderland. This was a major threat to business and financial stability, of course, and the precaution ended up being watered down in a major way in practice by the rhetoric of the business community. Lord Londonderry, acting as the voice of the business community, stated, contrary to the alarm raised by the medical boards of the doctors, that Sunderland is now in a more healthy state than has been usual in the autumnal season. Good. The actions of Londonderry, which eased cholera's road into England, spreading north to Scotland, south to Oxford, and then to London, wiping out some 52,000 people, were motivated and dictated by a value system analysis which placed business with mainland Europe higher than medical safety. And while the ramifications and the mass death and the fight and the flight from stricken areas were not expected by him maybe, and the disruptions to trade would have meant a vast impact upon Sunderland, which had 14,000 paupers out of 17,000 people, The point is that it's sort of widely agreed by historians that the business community loved to distort the statements from the doctors, claiming the whole thing was a conspiracy to cover up stolen cadavers for dissection by the medical community, and so on. We see at work here the sort of social immune disorder born out of necessity to conduct business over everything else. And I did say there was about 17,000 people in Sunderland, so they only wiped out almost 4 times that whole city in the rest of the UK. We also see this pattern and how it was actually defeated in the long march towards the ultimate development of a resistance to and a solution for the cholera pandemic. The going theory in the 1830s, which persisted as a general belief until practically the dawn of the 20th century, was that many illnesses, particularly cholera, were transmitted by sort of foul air. They called it a miasma, which had arisen out of rotting matter. It took the concerted and clever work of a man called John Snow, an anaesthetist who lived in central London, to uncover the analysis of death rate statistics provided to him by England's first really official statistician, William Farr. And that's how they really sourced the real cause of cholera and how it was being spread, which today we understand as, of course, the pollution by the cholera bacillus carried in the water supply, and not in fact the air, foul though it may have been, and indeed was. Snow actually noted that a violent outbreak of the disease centered around the communal pump in Broad Street, and his work with the local community, actually they removed the handle from the pump, and deaths dropped. Partly because of that, partly because everybody else who could afford it ran away. So they were accidentally helping themselves health-wise. When years later, William Farr, now more convinced of the sort of waterborne theory of cholera transmission, lobbied against the heavy interests of the London water companies, trying to correctly lay blame at their door for failure in hygiene and all kinds of other hijinks they played, he encountered the kind of resistance witnessed in Sunderland and which has been seen constantly in the modern day as well. Farr's words are actually worth repeating, partially because he wrote with a panache not normally attributed to a statistician. He said, "As the air of London is not supplied like water to its inhabitants by companies, the air has had the worst of it. For air, no scientific witnesses have been retained, no learned counsel has pleaded." I would say pled. Who am I to correct William Farr, however? So the atmosphere has been freely charged with the propagation and the illicit diffusion of plagues of all kinds, while Father Thames, deservedly reverenced throughout the ages, and the water gods of London have been loudly proclaimed immaculate and innocent. Here you see the sort of comfortable shift of blame onto media of communication, which at the time could not be bought or sold, that being the air. And we even have that bitter hint by Farr that the ruling companies occupy a position of almost theo-capitalistic reverence. Only after vast pressure by the population against the recalcitrant government, an uncooperative and censorious business community, and the construction of a whole sewer system under the supervision of engineer Joseph Bazalgette, who had kick-ass sideburns, you'll see, was the systemic integrity of public health in a position to actually combat a cholera epidemic. We know that because in 1892, a massive cholera outbreak in Hamburg killed close to 9,000 people in 6 weeks. And yet in England, which was expecting it next, based on prior infection patterns, a small bout of cholera broke out, largely in areas not even covered by Bazalgette's system. This presented a sort of a major watershed, as it's one of the first moments in public health that we can see an event by its relative non-occurrence, its non-happening. The same sort of pattern has been since seen with the introduction of the occupation of midwifery, which was decried by doctors as a threat to their job market. There you can see them being bad for the economy right there. And the resistance to the introduction of hand washing by, amongst others, a wonderful gentleman called Charles Meigs, who, betraying the thought genes of class and social standing doctrines implicit in his day, said that doctors are gentlemen and gentlemen's hands are clean. He was a doctor. Holy shit. Right up to the modern day, we have a similar pattern with the widespread prescription of antidepressants and antipsychotics, particularly to children, to nudge them into line with the generalized dissonant atmosphere into which they're born. According to Dr. David Healy, a noted psychiatrist, some 90% of school shootings in the US coincide with antidepressant treatment. To say nothing of the suppressed data by companies such as Eli Lilly on suicide levels related to serotonergic drugs, the collated adverse and unsustainable effects of stress treated with profitable patchwork drugs marks out our still present disconnect between true public health prioritization and the actual operation of social health support resulting from our value alignments within that social operation. Today's interest groups are bigger, smarter, and worst of all, in a way, they have more data about human behavior, which means they can use that data to make advertising stronger, more subtle, and control public discourse in a more enlightened age than even during the more credulous times when we as a species knew much less about the physical as well as the psychological world. I'd like to suggest the following small, very simple idea for improvement to combat this ideological and biopsychosocial misalignment. From primary school onwards, we teach public health education and public health history every year as an educational constant. Homeschoolers, relax and sit back down. You can do this at home as well. This module updates dynamically as new public health discoveries are made, and most importantly, we teach the failures as well as the successes of prior ages and of our own to inform the young of our fallibility, of the evolution of knowledge, particularly in the medical arena. Those failures should be taught as just as important revelations to our way of thinking as the positive discoveries themselves that we make. The benefits, in my view, are a better readiness to update our mindsets when it comes to new information, being aware of prior corrected knowledge, and a positive side effect, as it were, of this particular educational move, this sort of pedagogical disposition, if you like, might just be the consequent diffusing of this nationalistic and insular view held by respective nations that their country is the best and that a certain nation is the greatest civilization there could be, and all the other steadfast attitudes towards the current zeitgeist. It's no accident, I don't think, that the nations which proclaim themselves as the greatest, which is pretty much all of them, the more they do that, the more out of date their systems seem to be, and the slower the evolutionary process is. And of course, the thought gene mechanism for that is that, well, things are so awesome now, how could they ever get any better, right? If you build in the awareness, when it comes down to it, we as a species, no matter where we are situated, are only as good as our information up to that moment, and only as secure and free as the health systems and attitudes which align our well-being with the environmental challenges we face. And those allow us to be, in their direct and indirect consequences, safeguarded. And thus, you know, the vast undiscovered country of as yet unknown knowledge ahead of us has the potential to alleviate, to enrich, and to better inform the great structures of stability and harmony, which are our consolation and the true lifeblood of our human tenure on this planet, both individually and collectively, if only we are ready to accept where they lead us. Many thanks.
Good evening, everybody. I want to talk a little bit about not only the importance of modern communication tools in today's activism, but also how these tools can make or break us depending on how we use them. Obviously, communication has been evolving for quite a few millennia, but we don't have nearly enough time to cover all of that, so we're going to focus on more recent developments. Although political debates had already been taking place for many years, the first televised US presidential debate wasn't until 1960 between Senator John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon. Prior to that, listeners could only tune in on the radio. Interestingly, just the technical method by which this debate was communicated to the audience had a huge impact on how it was perceived. As illustrated by the Museum of Broadcast Communications, those who heard the first debate on the radio pronounced Nixon the winner, but the 70 million who watched it on television saw a candidate still sickly and obviously discomforted by Kennedy's smooth delivery and charisma. Those television viewers focused on what they saw, not what they heard. Studies of the audience indicated that among television viewers, Kennedy was perceived the winner of the first debate by a very large margin. The effects of watching the event on television changed the game so dramatically that candidates wouldn't agree to another televised debate until 16 years later, in 1976. The pressure was just too much. Now, more than 30 years later, a newer method of communication, the internet, is changing the way we perceive news, social events, and in a lot of ways, the entire world around us, more than ever, and a new breed of social awareness is emerging through online activism. We've seen this in recent times with movements like Occupy Wall Street, which sparked in New York and took less than a month to spread to at least 80 countries, spanning from Asia to Europe and every state in the US. According to a recent study by the Pew Internet and American Life Project, 38% of users on social networking sites use it to like or promote material related to politics or social issues. And if you guys aren't like in a coma from the last meal you had, you can raise your hand if you're a part of that 38%. 28% of social media users post stories and links for others to read, and 21% said they belong to a group on social networks that are involved in political or social issues. 31% use social networking to, quote, take action on a political or social issue that is important to them. So what does that mean for the Zeitgeist movement? Well, first, let's take a quick look at two of the world's most popular websites, starting with Facebook. Big surprise there. By the end of 2004, it had 1 million users, and by September of 2012, it had over 1 billion users. So that's about a 100,000% increase in about 8 years. And that over 1 billion people use the site each month, and 584 million active users are on there every day. 604 million are using Facebook from a mobile device every month. Now, the Zeitgeist Movement Global Facebook page has over 90,000 likes, but through those 90,000 fans, we actually have the potential to reach 31,728,904 of their friends just by posting and sharing content. And by the way, that was only a couple weeks ago. I actually went back and looked at the insights more recently, and the potential reach went up by about 500,000 people just from 700 more likes. So that's how that grows. As some of you may know, the TZM official channel on YouTube has a total of more than 29 million video views combined across about 200 or so videos. But get this, 20 million of those 29 million views are of Zeitgeist Moving Forward. So the third and most comprehensive documentary of the series accounts for almost 70% of the traffic to our channel. So it's in a pretty good spot considering YouTube's the third most popular website in the world. More video content is uploaded to YouTube in a 60-day period than the 3 major US television networks created in 60 years. And over 800 million unique visitors are there every month. It's got over 4 billion hours of video watched every month, and 72 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. And 70% of that traffic actually comes from outside the US, and people watch 1 billion views a day on YouTube mobile. Unfortunately, about 80 gajillion% of the traffic is for Gangnam Style. But to be fair, a large percentage of those are actually probably mine. But nevertheless, the song is in Korean, and yet no one in any other part of the country seems to care, or no one in any other part of the world actually seems to care that they can't understand the lyrics. So I guess that does at least somewhat demonstrate my point that the internet, and perhaps music in this case, really does make the world a smaller place. No more competent necessarily, but smaller. That is if you consider 225 million miles of fiber optic cable small. So why am I boring you with all of these statistics? Well, just 50 years ago, activists relied on rallying together locally. Today, with the click of a button, we can be in a TeamSpeak meeting with activists from all around the world. We have an online newsletter with contributions from various international chapters in different languages, and we can hop on a Skype for a one-on-one orientation with screen sharing. Our technology team keeps us up to date with news and information in applied sciences, life sciences, natural sciences, and social sciences through zeitnews.org, where content is posted and shared with thousands every day. And the TZM Global Radio Show helps members stay tuned in to current events and topics of interest in the movement, while also making an ongoing effort to engage new listeners. Of course, none of this is to detract from the importance of local chapter projects and street activism that exist and take place in a physical realm, as those are where bonds truly form and how changes really happen in the real world. The internet is just a tool that facilitates and in most cases significantly expedites the necessary communication and exchanges of information that make us as humans so eager to transform an idea from paper into reality. So in short, a lot of times we may be introduced to an idea online, or we may find out about it in person and then learn more about it online, but for the most part, it's when we take what we've learned and apply it to our everyday lives and conversations that change truly starts to become organic, when we put our ideas into action. But what happens when those actions become misguided? In August of 2011, after several days of looting in Britain, Prime Minister David Cameron suggested that the government should have the ability to turn off social media during riots. A Wall Street Journal article on the subject reads, "Thousands of online posts had planned mayhem more quickly than a police could respond." A member of parliament pointed out that the police can close roads in emergencies, arguing, "We'd all survive if Twitter shut down for a short while during major riots." It goes on to explain, Robert Andrews, a reporter for the Paid Content UK website, asked Twitter users whether they'd prefer to keep the service available so they could chat about the television music competition, The X Factor, or let the service be closed temporarily so that fellow citizens like shopkeepers need not be assaulted, have their property and premises pilfered and trashed, and so that they need not live in fear. Though it was an admittedly unscientific survey, Mr. Andrews nevertheless reports that every Twitter respondent opted for The X Factor. He concludes, "So addicted are we to our electronic connections, we simply cannot bear to be parted for even an hour or two in the name of public safety while London burns." Hopefully you've figured out by now that the Zeitgeist movement does not condone violence. And if we could all rest assured that the sole reason behind certain officials shutting down social media would actually be for the aims of public safety, then maybe these Twitter users would have given the idea a little more merit. But it could be argued that their votes were, in all actuality, simply against shutting down Twitter or any form of online communication for any reason, rather than their votes just being superficially in favor of a TV show at the expense of public safety. After all, as is already quoted all too often, they who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. In other words, if potential threats, deemed so of course by a controlling party, become reason enough to shut down one of our widest reaching forms of communication, then it's only a matter of time before such threats, or rather threats of threats, are manifested in order to justify social media blackouts. As it stands, these calls are and should be primarily left up to the administrators of each individual website. In fact, as the article goes on to say, the big social media sites are able to draw reasonably clear lines between fighting crime and protecting free speech. Hundreds of Facebook staffers monitor posts around the world to enforce its ban against the service, using the service to plan violence. It closed down a third Palestinian Intifada page. Twitter bans direct specific threats of violence. It's up to us to use our communication tools responsibly. And when we all come together armed with ideas rather than anger and violence, we can show the world that not everyone who wants change necessarily wants to start lighting fires or spray painting their demands on someone else's property. One of a number of ways the movement gathers nonviolently to spread awareness is through the Zeitgeist Media Festival, an annual event that brings the artistic and activist communities together in the hope to inspire change, and of course, Zeitgeist Day, an annual event where the coolest people in the world get together and discuss the need to move into a sustainable socioeconomic system. While the internet can obviously be a very powerful tool for communication purposes, it's no secret that it does have its drawbacks. For one, it could be argued that the human element is a bit removed by not necessarily being able to converse with people face to face. We see this on a regular basis anytime we witness a common exchange between people saying things to each other that they would never say to someone in person. I'm not going to mention any names. But even that aside, with so much information out there on the web, accessible to anyone with a computer, it can become a crutch just to kind of lazily point people to links and materials and lose that drive to actually engage in meaningful conversations and to be willing to learn something from one another, to understand each other. A common example of this sort of apathy is when people who have questions or objections to the resource-based economy are automatically told to do more research. Unfortunately, that response doesn't really work, and in fact, I've sometimes found it to be counterproductive. It's often a valid criticism and perfectly good advice, but in order for it to have any meaning or any effect, it has to come with an explanation. Granted, the person in question is presumably lazy for not doing his or her own research, but we might as well lead by example. If you know how to counter arguments made against a resource-based economy, then you can do so on your own. You start by explaining it in your own words as best as you can, and list the sources yourself, such as links, articles, videos, etc. That's really the best you can do, and if they don't acknowledge your answers, then that's on them, but at least they can't accuse you of being dogmatic and avoiding their questions. When we come across people who may blatantly misconstrue the fundamentals of a resource-based economy, they've either A, done the research and still don't get it, or B, haven't and probably aren't going to do the research, at least not without you holding their hand. So the canned response of telling people to do more research just sounds to them like a cop-out answer to cover up the fact that you can't necessarily back up what you're saying. Or worse, they may even get the sense that we think we're so enlightened that we cannot be bothered with such silly questions or objections. And this, of course, can actually hurt the overall cause. So I say, call their bluff and answer the question or objection right then and there. Don't become too overly dependent on other people or other writings to do it. Of course, this comes with a big responsibility on our part, and that is understanding the material. Not just zeitgeist materials, the films, the lectures, those are all great, but it helps if we can really dive into these subjects and get a good grip on what it is that we're advocating and why, from a scientific, social, historical, and economic perspective. To really be able to offer your own responses that are more tailored to what that particular person might be asking or talking about. Of course, we have to use our own judgment and know where to draw the line between answering legitimate questions and responding to endless trolling. But the point is, we're getting into dangerous territory if we actually do hear a question or concern that we genuinely can't answer, and then we just argue anyway because we believe so strongly in the kind of society we advocate. If you don't know the answer to a question, go find it. We don't need to rely strictly on TZM materials. There are plenty of sources out there. This kind of knowledge and participation would ultimately require and thereby naturally develop a more thorough understanding of the material within the movement itself, as opposed to just regurgitation of statements, facts, and information that at the end of the day lacks any real context to the listener. It is critical that if we are going to suggest to people that they do more research, we take it upon ourselves to back it up. For example, you might say, I disagree that humans are naturally greedy or that they naturally prefer competition. So-and-so studies show that we are naturally wired for empathy and cooperation, but this has been stifled due to scarcity. Look at these sources and tell me what you think. Also, can you point me to some studies that show humans are naturally selfish, instead of just saying, clearly you need to do more research? Or you might say, actually, I think you've misunderstood the resource-based economic model. It's not the same as using barter because trade and private property are naturally obsolete in a state of abundance. I think you will find such and such segment of Doug's or Peter's or whoever's lecture explains this pretty well at however many minutes in. Here are some other sources that explain it in more detail. What do you think of what this says about a systems approach in the last paragraph? Instead of saying, if you think RBE is the same as a monetary system, you obviously haven't done any research. Really taking the extra time to learn the materials and then sharing it with others in this way can be a very powerful approach for at least two reasons. One, it genuinely answers the question or concern, if the person is genuinely asking, and it can open a new line of discussion. Two, if they're not genuinely asking and just being argumentative, you will immediately be able to tell when they respond with something like, human desires will always be unlimited, or it doesn't matter how you organize the system because central or planned economies always fail, without actually addressing a single one of your statements or sources, in which case you don't really need to waste your time. So with the right approach, it's a win-win situation. You either A, answer the question satisfactorily and continue the discussion, or B, patiently and intelligently determine that the person does not actually want to hear the answer. In contrast, when you simply lead with, do more research, you skip both A and B and end up with C, not answering the question, which gives them an easy out that you probably don't know what you're talking about. In short, I think the more knowledge you have, the more patience you have. It's frustrating not to be able to answer questions and objections, especially when you know there's an answer, but maybe you can't formulate it well. Maybe you know you heard Peter say it somewhere, but you don't know where, and you can't remember exactly what he said. That doesn't really work. You have to learn it yourself. Otherwise, it becomes a dangerous crutch to just say, do research, and it gets very easy to get angry and impatient with people. On the other hand, it can be liberating to be able to effectively address objections. And at the very least, it reinforces your own understanding, even if no one's really listening. It helps to respond to people with open-ended answers, that is, an explanation followed by a question which encourages him or her to either elaborate on or at least question the legitimacy of their position. Even when pointing someone to a source, you might still try to point to a specific statement or segment and ask that person what he or she thinks of it. Try not to assume that the source is the answer and that's the end of it. Ultimately, what it boils down to is that we can get so used to hearing the same old objections that we might accidentally be too quick to tell someone to just do research or read the FAQ. Just try to be mindful of this and make sure that that's actually what needs to happen. And on top of that, don't be afraid to offer your help. Whether communicating with others online or in person, if we expect to see any kind of realistic change in society, we owe it to ourselves to become subject matter experts in the methodology that will bring this change about. This way, the next time someone asks if you're a member of the Zeitgeist movement, you can confidently say, no, I am the Zeitgeist movement. Thank you.
Good evening. Once again, my name is Eva Omori, and thank you. And we're getting to the fun part, the transition. Let's do this. Yeah. Okay, if it were only so simple as to speak it. All right. When we think about transition, it is important to remind ourselves what it is we are transitioning to exactly. A move from the scarcity-driven market economy to a system of direct resource management and scientific application to meet the needs of the human species and secure the habitat is a transition of values at its root. It is a transition to reinforce and reward balance, social contribution, and ecological respect, rather than what we reinforce today, which is selfishness, competition, and exploitation. At the core of our current model is really an anti-society ethic. This disposition has proven deeply destructive in the long run. How to move to such a social model from where we are today? It is, of course, naive to assume we can predict the future, given the pressures that keep the current system in place. All of us are forced into this caustic market psychology in order to maintain survival for ourselves and our family, and hence, our values are deeply associated to these methods, whether we like it or not. As we engage the environment, our brains wire themselves in a very literal way, being reinforced by our actions. And just as a person can learn a skill and have that skill become second nature without much direct conscious thought to execute once learned, we humans perform actions on a day-to-day level with the same kind of learned mind lock. In fact, we often don't even know we are behaving in so-called selfish ways at times, since everything around us appears to be working the exact same way, creating perceived normality. Therefore, the Zeitgeist movement sees the shifting of people's values as the most important necessity. How this is done is related to education, while also attempting to create conditions which, again, hopefully reinforce these new sustainable values, inching out change. There are two ways to think about a social transition into a natural law, resource-based economy. First, a step-by-step scenario, which then lays out a framework for a second scenario. However, the first scenario is really a fantasy. It assumes there is agreement of the political economic power structure and the community, that the human species has decided to do this move in a step-by-step manner. Of course, we all know, it would likely never happen this way. The train of thought is still important to express with respect to how we think about the logic of a transition. Concluding this introduction, it is important to point out that many who criticize the Zeitgeist movement do so not because they disagree with the direction, but because they do not understand how to get there. The best analogy to counter this is the argument a very sick person seeking to get well will do whatever he or she has to, even if at a given point in time, the solution to their illness is not readily apparent. The difficulty in implementing a new social system does not remove the necessity for it. The fact is, we humans can change the world quite easily if we can find a unified common ground to do so. Again, this is the intent of the global Zeitgeist movement. Furthermore, it's also important to note that we are always in transition. There are no utopias, and even if we accomplish 40% of the move to a natural law, resource-based economy as we define it in theory, it will be worth it. A systematic move from the capitalist market economy to a natural law, resource-based economy could theoretically occur through a step-by-step socialization of the core attributes of the societal infrastructure. Essentially, we dismantle one layer while implementing a new one in the most fluid way we can. This term socialization is appropriate to use here. It simply means that the necessity of money and the market mechanisms as we know it will no longer apply to the given social attribute. The four core societal layers of food production, utilities, basic goods, and transportation will be discussed further. To summarize the approach, the task would be accomplished through the strategic application of technology and efficiency waste removing strategies, along with an adjustment of wages to compensate for job losses, along with a shortening and sharing of the workday to also compensate for job losses. A critical component that enables the capacity of the new social model to produce our basic standard of living is the liberal application of modern technology and a systems approach to social organization. Since the current model is literally based on a technical inefficiency to keep the system going, the more efficient the system becomes, the less traditional labor is required. Therefore, in transition, starting within a market economy, measures to compensate for this loss are required. The four core societal layers are obviously fragments with synergistic relationships, which requires other types of technical evaluation. However, for the sake of reasoning here, these core attributes of our day-to-day lives are essentially what maintain our general health and basic standard of living, so it should be suffice for the sake of exemplification. The first core societal layer is food production. The technology for high-efficiency automated food systems is a reality today, with vertical farm technology and low-energy and low-impact fertilization methods such as hydroponics and aeroponics. Desalination processes could enable the building of these facilities along most major coastlines, producing organic food in quantities to meet the needs of the population regionally and locally. In short, if such advanced methods were implemented, the need for purchasing basic food staples would no longer be required. Even today, the world produces enough food to feed the planet many times over. This shows that the need to place restricted monetary value on basic foodstuff is not required. There is no legitimate technical reason, even within a monetary economy, grocery stores today cannot provide the same type of foodstuff to a given regional population without the need for financial exchange. The second core societal layers is utilities. The hydrocarbon economy continues to cause turmoil, not only on the environmental level, but also due to the inevitable scarcity of the resource itself. There is no debate as to the fact that oil is finite and its combustion is detrimental to the environment. Given solar, tide, wind, geothermal, and other means of renewable energy, there's no reason that any of us would need to pay for energy if properly localized and interconnected. Advanced solar panels alone, applied to every house with sun exposure, feeding excess energy back into a community grid, would eliminate electricity needs immediately based on current statistics capacities. Electricity can be used to replace gas for heating and most other uses. While water, which is a nominal financial expense even today in the West, further improvements can be made in industrial efficiency to recede pollution and maintain a regional surplus. Those who have had water shortages in the world have had technical resolutions for years via desalination and other purification systems. It has been, again, the lack of financial resources of these regions which have caused the problems, not the lack of technical ability. So, once an advanced system approach is taken to resource management, the marketization of these commodities and services is no longer necessary. Before I go further, the question arises, if we create systems which eliminate the vast majority of employment due to the high level of technical efficiency, don't we need people to service and supervise these systems? The answer, of course, is yes. This is not a utopia where no one needs to do anything. Imagine if we can have 5% of the society, in terms of traditional labor time, serve to operate these systems. It would be to everyone's advantage to donate a certain amount of time in a type of rotational fashion. After all, they are only helping themselves directly. Given the amount of relative free time, working for the whole of society would be the highest form of social contribution once these systems are in place. Would you work for free if you only had to work 5% of the time you do today to maintain a high standard of living? Yes. That was a resounding yes. This third societal layer is basic good production. The spectrum of basic good production is wide, ranging from core staples such as household items, clothes, and communication technology, to specific tools for specialized tasks, such as musical instruments and other increasingly less demanded items. The best way to think about this is as a spectrum of demand, with common needs on one side and specialized or luxury type goods on the other. While the advancement of science and technology will likely facilitate a vast amount of variation for production, for the sake of transition, in the immediate future we can simplify. Overall, each industry or sub-industry needs to unify in its operation to enable the highest level of production and output efficiency possible. The corporate structures would combine based on genre, using that collaborative capacity to increase efficiency while reducing waste and competitive multiplicity. This would set the stage for the creation of a fully synergistic industrial system, applying advanced automation to remove human labor and inevitably increase efficiency. In this transitional proposal, hours worked would shift in proportion to job losses, coupled with hourly wage rates shifting. In other words, assuming an initial average workday need of 8 hours per person, incurring a loss of growth jobs by 50%, the workday then would be cut by 50% as well. So if we have a hypothetical economy with 1,000 people and 50% of them were displaced by technological employment, the day is then divided between them, so everyone now works 4 hours instead of 8. Again, the fact that goods and services are becoming free in the economy means that there is less need for prior levels of purchasing power, so a 50% cut in wages is directly compensated for. We are phasing the monetary system out in this process. In cases where this isn't feasible, there would be an increase in hourly wage rates in the same basic proportion, compensating for the average loss. Transportation. The production of vehicles, which is largely automated today, isn't much of a problem. The issue here is access, application, and necessity. All of us who travel to centralized offices, usually participating in occupations with questionable relevance, would be amazed at the inefficiency. There are very few occupations today which really require direct location interaction anymore. Even industrial production facilities, once further automated, would only require a small number of people on location, with most processes administered remotely. So a strategic move to stop the wasteful 9-to-5 traditional travel to work and back would need to be made. Everyone would have the option to be equipped by whatever means to operate their business operations from their home. The amount of saved energy and lives would be enormous, given the nature of travel and accidents. Beyond that, as far as infrastructure, systems of sharing, such as they have now with bicycles in Europe, should be applied to vehicles and everything else we can find, coupled with incorporation of mass transit. This, again, is to be a step-by-step process of improvement, where different regions are purposefully reorganized to favor the highest level of technical travel efficiency possible. Localizing labor, locations remote access to limit travel needs, sharing systems for vehicles, and liberal mass transit would profoundly change the nature of transport infrastructure, reduce energy use, increase safety, and allow for further changes as the transition continues. Now, while other examples of the step-by-step could be given here, I hope the logic is clear. It is not difficult to realize how these moves could be made if, and I emphasize if, there was the sanction of the community. Sadly, we cannot expect this type of ease. So with this general outline of reasoning stated of how to break down the current system step by step to implement the new one in mind, let's now take a realistic look at what a transition to a new society may hold given the reality we have today. It is important to understand that the intention of transition to social sustainability has been under the surface of our culture for a long time. The notion of the green economy and periodic outbursts by civil rights groups such as Occupy Wall Street shows a deep interest to change the world and make it more equal, humane, and sustainable. It is a deeply important acknowledgement that in order to create a more sustainable, humane world, a complete move out of the current social architecture is critical. Once the logic is followed in this regard, we find we simply cannot fix the problems inherent to the current social architecture. We need to evolve out of it. To do this, global social movement tactics become critical to put pressure on the existing system, along with helping change the intents and values of the culture itself. The unfortunate yet predictable consequences of what we could call societal collapse is ever apparent. Societal collapse is not an absolute notion, it is relative. While many of us in the West, in our day-to-day lives, even though we may have great amounts of public debt, private debt, overbearing work environments, and other stressors, we usually don't look around and necessarily deem the society as being in a state of breakdown, because we are now so used to the homelessness, poverty, periodic crisis, and other inefficiencies. It isn't like one day we're going to go outside and everything is on fire and everyone is suffering or dead in the streets. The awareness is the trend. And if we look at the trend of the core life support attributes, we find that most everything is in a state of decay. Overall, the market economy, in whatever form today, globally, can be found as the root of the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, pollution, depletion, conflict generations, and other issues that continue to produce environmental negative retroactions with the effects on human health. Both public health and environmental stability are increasingly becoming destabilized in the long run. Furthermore, mechanization, which is becoming a powerful force to enable cost efficiency for corporate savings, is and will lead to vast unemployment. At what point do we think about a failure of the economic model with respect to levels of employment? 10, 20, 40%? Needless to say, at some point, this clash between mechanization and employment for the sake of profit will generate a severe public revolt. All it takes, for example, is one major transport corporation on the West Coast to go on strike and shut down food supplies. This type of reaction could be systemic. So social collapse is a very negative thing, but it is also a natural consequence of evolution. Problems lead to creativity, and creativity leads to transition, if we are willing to move on. The question is, how much suffering will we endure? It isn't that any of us want to see pain and suffering, it is simply inevitable in the current social system. And the faster we can get this information out there in the community regarding actual change to the system, the faster we can move on. The very moment we have one person starving in any society, a society that can produce abundance, we are experiencing the failure of the system. Today, there are 1 billion. With this collapse pressure apparent, coupled with a basic understanding of how a step-by-step transition could unfold, let us now talk about transitional activism. The goal here is to not only facilitate a move to the new model, but also work to help those suffering in the current model, basically bringing them in first in this process of transition. With the growing technological employment in the world today, and government and corporations looking the other way for as long as they can, if we can continue to support solutions to ease the stress on the population, coupled with removing of support for the current system, we are on the right path. One approach is the use of mutual credit systems. These are currently legal overall and exist today in small pockets of the world, largely hidden from public knowledge. A mutual credit system is a form of barter for services or goods which allow created exchange values to be applied to other goods and services, removing the one-to-one correlation common to simple barter. Local Exchange Trading System, LETS, is an example. It assists an interest-free, non-inflationary form of exchange where value cannot float as it does today. There are a number of variations of the time bank kind of system, and they are becoming ever more sophisticated in their programming and malleability. One benefit for those who do not have a job or money is the ability to exchange with others without the use of nation's currency. The other benefit is that each exchange that occurs within this kind of method is a loss of growth pressure in the economy. Imagine if 50% of Americans decided to use these systems. The economy, as we know in traditional terms, would lose 50% of its GDP. The next tactic is the use of community systems of sharing. For For example, in the United States, online resources like neighborgoods.net and sharesomesugar.com have tools and other items listed in a sharing system where they are made available like a library. Each can check out, borrow these items when needed. As minimal as these may seem, if we use our imagination, we could see this library concept extend greatly, such as with automobiles and other items used more sparsely. Sites such as freecycle.org promotes waste reduction by making items no longer needed available at no cost. Again, imagine if all communities did this. We would help those who didn't have access, coupled with removing growth pressures on the economic system, forcing change. It would also be more environmentally friendly and sustainable. The final tactic comes from the mass petition campaigns and awareness acts to show the world what we are doing. Obviously, TZM is doing this right now across the world with our global Z-Day events. However, more strategic methods to communicate these technical possibilities will occur over time. The Global Redesign Institute, for example, is a large-scale macro design project to do just this. Now, in conclusion, people always ask about backlash. Clearly, we live in a world where the powers have become rather maniacal in their views, and historically, any attempt at a new social models has been met with conflict from the external. Acts of the state of this nature have usually been given an excuse. Protests which turn violent, for example, open the floodgates for oppression. There is a reason why peace activists in t-shirts are met with police in riot gear and weapons. They need violence to perpetuate violence. TZM cannot let this happen. TZM is not a protest movement in this sense, and you will not see TZM activists throwing stones or yelling at buildings. We are going to do this through strategic action in a very sophisticated, peaceful, intellectual manner. Any other abrasive action will only fail the movement. This concludes my talk. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you to Peter Joseph. Updated information will be available via the orientation guide, TZM Defined, Realizing a New Train of Thought. Thank you again.